Welcome to Climate and Water Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force 4th Virtual Summit Series. We're proud to have been around for 4 years, and we're excited about starting today. And we always start with the land acknowledgement, and we're so happy and blessed that our good friend Karina Gould is here. She's the Confederated Villages of Lejeune, the tribal chair and the co-founder of Segurite Land Trust. So thank you, Karina. You've been such a great champion, been with us all 4 years, almost every summit. So thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me again, Cheryl. So good to be here with everybody. And a lot of times what we do is we acknowledge the lands that we're on. So we'll acknowledge the lands that we're on. But I think that what Cheryl often does, and many other people that ask for land acknowledgements, is that there's a reciprocity in the work that we do together. And so Cheryl and I have been working for many years now, and stuff around climate change and about sacred site protection in the Bay Area. So I am Sohorshe Duhi Ka'at Lashanka Ka'at Ra'at Karina. In the original language of the East Bay, the Chochenyo language, I said, good morning, my name's Karina Gould. We are on the traditional territory of the Confederated Villages of Lejeune Nation. One of the territories, the territory of Huchun. If you happen to be in Oakland, Berkeley, Emeryville, Alameda, or Albany, you are in the part of Huchun that I'm talking about. So our territories were larger than cities and smaller than counties, but they were connected by waterways and our sacred mountain. The mountain behind us is called Mount Tushtak. Tushtak is the place that we are created from, not just the generic name of Ohlone people, but the Bay Miwok and the Delta Yokut and the Patwin people all come from this sacred mountain. This mountain was revered, and only very special people could go to the very top. Today, after settlers have moved into our territories, it has gone from this very sacred place to a place called Mount Diablo, a mountain of the devil. It's the change of the name changes the idea of what people could do with this place. And so I know with like-minded people here today that we are trying to figure out how to be in right relationships with the world right now. So we recognize that our ancestors had been here for thousands of years, and that we continue to be here working to save and protect our sacred sites, our land, our waterways, our air, and our relationship with fire. Today, we're going to be doing wonderful work and talking about something called H2O, water. And I'm going to talk to you about that a little bit in a little bit. But this morning, I'm going to invite us to breathe together and to, as the entire country is burning, and we have the blessing to be here in the Bay Area where temperatures are cooler. Let's take in a deep breath for those that are having a hard time with the heat right now, and then we'll let it go. Take a deep breath in and let it go. We want to let our minds rest today as we come into this work, this important work that we're doing together. And we may have woke up frazzled, or trying to get here on time, or our coffee machine wasn't working. Who knows what happened to us this morning? But we want to leave those things outside of this meeting so that we could open up our hearts and our minds and our ears so that we can hear each other, so that we can do the work to ensure that folks are here for the next 7 generations. So let's take in a deep breath for that. And we'll let it go. Right now, I'm working with many people across this nation who is doing work for water and sacred sites and for the protection of our Mother Earth. And so we have folks from all different backgrounds and denominations that are doing this important work all over the world. And sometimes these people's lives become endangered. And so we want to say special blessings and prayers and offer good thoughts and a good breath for those that are standing on the front lines of oppression against isms all over the world. And so let's take a deep breath in for that. And let it go. Let's take a deep breath in for our bodies that contain all that we are right now, this temporary place. Let's take a deep breath in for our health and our mind and all of our relations, everybody that we are related to behind us and those that are coming after us. That those people, those folks that are, we pray for those next 7 generations to come, realizing that we're only a bridge between the past and the future, and that everything that we decide to do has an impact on those yet to come. We say, send breath, a good breath for those that are yet to come, that we come together to work to ensure that they have fresh water to drink, good air to breathe, good soil to grow food and medicine, and a good relationship with fire again. Let's take a deep breath. And let's let it go. And I'm so happy that I'm here with all of you today. And I hope that we are all present now. And thank you so much, Cheryl, for inviting me to be here.
Thank you, Karina. So you can come back in a minute and talk about, I'll introduce you again after I speak. Thank you, Karina. That was amazing as always. It's always just a wonderful start of our day to be in your presence. So welcome to Climate and Water, the CEMTF's 4th Virtual Summit Series. And the title of the full series is Climate, Social Justice, Rights to Nature, United Action for a Just and Regenerative Future. As I said before, this is our 4th year of being around, and we're so excited. And in case you don't know who I am, I'm the founder of the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force and a former council member in the city of Berkeley. I also founded, one of the founders for the Berkeley Equity Summit Alliance, which is BIPOC community members in Berkeley. And I'm part of Mobilize Berkeley, which is the Climate Emergency Mobilization Task Force and UC Berkeley Student Environmental Resource Center. And I'm part of the Interfaith Council of Alameda County and the network of elected officials and staff. So I'm kind of busy. And I want to thank you all for being here. And I want to thank the Planning and Logistics Committee, Jack, Ruth, Karina, and myself, and the Steering Committee, which is Jack, Mayor Eduardo Martinez, Karina, and myself. Did I miss somebody? I'm not sure. Anyway, and then this year we did an amazing, some amazing work with our incredible fellows, Eric, Jessica, and Sarah, who did a year's worth of work on the Alameda County Climate Scorecard, which we debuted in May. So that will be sent out soon. And then we kicked off Climate and Water this past Wednesday, where we heard from Aurora Mahasin, speaking about when did dirt get dirty and how soil and native plants will save cities. So I want to thank her for that incredible presentation. And I want to thank all the speakers today, Karina, Ellen, Ondi, Haley, Kia, Cheryl, and Rahima. And again, thank you all for being here. And thank you to the folks who donated. And there's still time to donate. You can register for the next upcoming series and donate. And so water is defined as a clear liquid that has no color, taste, smell, and it falls from clouds and as rain forms in streams, lakes, oceans, and seas, as we all know. And it's a major constituent of all living matter. We need water, H2O, 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen, existing in gaseous, liquid, and solid states. And it plays important roles in the world economy. 70% of fresh water is used for agricultural, and fishing and salt and water bodies continues to be a major source of food for many parts of the world. 6.5% is people get rely on global protein. It's providing fishing and stuff provides 6.5% of global protein. And 1.1 billion worldwide lack access to water. And close to 3 billion have scarcity of water for at least a month out of the year. So as I said before, you may have heard me, Jack likes to quote me on this one, which is, we're in a heap of trouble and the heap keeps getting larger and larger. So the climate crisis presents itself in so many ways, and water plays a significant role. There's catastrophic flooding around the world and here in the United States. You know, everybody is dealing with fires right now, as Karina said, and then like the lack of water, drought, and melting glaciers, sea level rise, and sadly, TEPCO, the Tokyo Electric Power Company, is thinking of putting wastewater, nuclear wastewater, in our ocean. So water is just so significant, and it's a vital nutrient to life in every cell, and regulates internal body temperature, and we sweat it out, and carbohydrates in our food are metabolized and transported through the water in our bloodstream. So, you know, water is comes out of us in urination, you know. So water just plays such a significant role that we wanted to spend some time on that today. And so now everybody just sit back, get your coffee, get a glass of water, and get your breakfast. And here are our amazing speakers. And so I want you to enjoy this time we have together this morning, because water is life. And now we're going to hear from, again, the tribal chair of the Confederated Villages of Lejeune and the co-founder of Segurite Land Trust, our good friend Karina Gould. So go ahead, Karina. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by grabbing some water. Let's all take a drink of water. And you know, there was this interesting thing. I'm going to probably tell stories. So don't fall back asleep, all right? But I'm probably going to tell stories. I'm not a scientist, but I grew up in my watershed, and so, but one of our elders told us a long time ago that when you get up in the morning, and that you should, one of the first things you should do is you should take a drink of water. But before you take that drink of water, that you should speak into the water. Speak into the water good things that you want for the day. Speak into the water, thanks for your life. Thanks for waking up in the morning. Thank you for giving life to you. And so when we teach our children this, you know, that it's important that this is a gift that we have, that we can't just treat it badly. And so I'm going to offer, let's take a drink of water together. And so when we drink that water, first thing in the morning, sometimes you can feel it going down, all the way down. It's like when on a hot day, when you drink something really cold and you could feel it going down into your body. It's that beautiful feeling that you know that you're alive, but that this essence, this water that we call it, sea in our language is called. Water is called by many different things all over the world, but it's alive. And so we know that it's alive, that it has a way that it reacts to us in good ways. So indigenous knowledge has always talked about that. So it's an old teaching for us about how we relate to water, right? So I told you the story about how an elder asking us this, but it was some years ago that there was a Japanese scientist that actually did a study on water droplets and what it looked like when you said really good things to it. And they put it under a microscope. And when you said really good things to the water created these beautiful, um, I can't, like, the word came that went from my head. But these beautiful designs, right, out of water, like crystals that it would create, that it would do this. But if you said bad things to water, that it would shrink and look deformed. And so even though these indigenous knowledges were known, scientists figured out that this was true, that water actually reacts to us in the way that we react to it. And so I think it's really important that when it's not just as hashtag water is life, but in our language, it means si uti isha, which means water, it is alive. And have songs for water. You know, there's a lot of scientists now and many people around the world that are looking for indigenous knowledges around how do we save ourselves from climate disaster. And so, but then don't want to hear these stories as true unless there's a scientist that actually shows that it's true. So I always like to tell that story about this scientist that actually did do this study and found out that water does react to us as human beings and what we do to it. But then what do we do with water right now? Water is, as Cheryl said, it's becoming scarce. A few years ago in Central California, there was a whole city that was a whole town that was going to run out of water, completely out of water. It wasn't on major news. People weren't talking about it. But here in California, in Central California, that this community was going to lose water because the water table was shrinking in Central California. We know that there was a body of water in Central California, huge lake before, and that there was a huge water table underneath there. An interesting thing about water tables is that you can pump water out of it. You can get wells out of it. But if you take too much of it, it's like a sponge, and a sponge that deflates. But the problem is that you can never inflate it again. When I was a kid, I remember watching a show on Channel 9, KQED, and they talked about how the water table was decreasing in Central California and how it would become a desert at some point. And I thought, you know, it would come to me every so often as I was getting older. It's impossible that we would have a desert. But today we see that the water table is almost completely evaporated and gone from Central Valley. That's why we're talking about creating these huge water tunnels, these delta tunnels to take these water from Northern California down that way to shuttle water there. We're doing crazy things. Human beings have always moved water. My ancestors moved water to help us to move it into places that we wanted it. We didn't actually grow crops, but people did all over the world. They grew crops and they moved water. They created aqueducts. Yes, thank you so much for that, Aurora. They've done a lot of things with water, but I think that in most traditional places, people really revered water and what it brings to us, right? There's a whole bunch of things that's happening. I think that one of the hugest things that happened in 2016 was Standing Rock, when thousands of people went to stop a pipeline from going through the river there and through native land, and that there was a call out. And people from all over the world came, people from the Amazon and Hawaii and all kinds of places came there from all over the world to pray and to put their bodies on the line to stop that water, because it wasn't going to just affect Native people's water. Everybody that was downriver would also be affected when this pipeline would eventually burst. And so as we begin to think about that, we have to think about what are we going to do as human beings to take care of this precious thing that gives us life. You know, we use these horrible words in the English language called commodities, that water is a commodity, and that people are beginning to think about how do you sell water on the open market in a different kind of way. How do you begin to trade and sell water rights? No one should be able to own water. As human beings, we should be able to have access to water always. When we look at what happened in Flint, Michigan, right, when there were people that were poisoned, people that are of color that were poisoned by the water systems that were not taken care of. We can look at, I think Cheryl talked about the idea of that there was scarcity of water in places, and that people don't have access to water. And I think that in America, we think of, oh, there's places in, you know, in Central America and South America and Africa where there's no wells and there's no water. That in reservations today, in what is now America, there is no running water. People have to haul water from miles away to their houses, and that we don't understand that today because we're so disconnected. That the water that people get sometimes is contaminated, especially when you're talking about Navajo Nation, where people do coal mining there, and they move millions of water, feet of water every single day to push coal to a different location. That fresh water that we should all have access to, that is going to keep us alive, is actually is doing work only for a few people to make them rich, while people on the reservation have no access to fresh water on a daily basis. There was things that happened here, not just in Standing Rock, but we had a wonderful group of folks, the Idle No More San Francisco Bay folks, that did water walks along the bay for many years. And it was Indigenous women who came together with people, allies and accomplices, that walked our waterways as we began to look at the contamination and the oil refineries that are in our bay that affect our lives, not just our oxygen, but the waters that we are drinking. I often think about the idea of the story of salmon. And I think about the story of salmon because I've been working in collaboration with Chief Colleen Sisk. She's the Winnemem-Wintu spiritual leader and chief of their tribe. And Colleen is also a not federally recognized tribe, just like our tribe is not federally recognized. And she's way up in Shasta, and her life calling has been to speak for the salmon. And I think about the salmon and how interesting the salmon were, because salmon actually tells us about the health of ourselves, right? And California is really interesting and kind of complicated in a lot of different ways, but it is the newest part of what is called the United States, right? It's the on this land base, California came in pretty last, but it has changed the landscape, having development here and at record speed, changed the bay and our waterways by allowing dredging to happen, and by the waters getting warmer, and by pollution happening along our bays. Our ancestors lived a sustainable life eating out of the bay, shellfish and salmon and trout and all different kinds of things. And today we can't sustain ourselves as human beings out of a waterway that is just that is right here, right? How horrible it is not to just think about fresh water, but the bay waters and the ocean as well. They're all connected, that these waterways are connected to each other, that salmon, the story of that was written in a diary of Spaniards that were chasing my ancestors from around the Richmond area up to the Carquinez Strait. They were chasing my ancestors, some of my ancestors up there, and they got to the Carquinez Strait, and they lost my ancestors at that point. But they got there salmon run, and they said that there were so many silverback salmons in the waterway that they could practically walk to the other side on their backs. Imagine that many salmon in our waterway. That's just one run. There was 4 runs of salmon that used to come through our bay, up through our delta, up to the rivers of where they were born to. So it made sense to me that when we took over Sigorate, which is on the Carquinez Strait in 2011, that this sacred site would be a site that we had had ceremony for thousands and thousands of years. These salmons that actually does a lot of work for human beings, and we take it for granted because we love to eat salmon. At least I do. Salmon's really good food, gives us a lot of nutrients. But salmon is this magical fish, and I love the way that Colleen talks about it. That this magical fish that she speaks for. You see, the Winnemem-Wintu lost their waterway. They put the Shasta Dam up. When the Shasta Dam was put up, it flooded out their village sites, and then there was no way for the salmon to actually get up to the top of the river. Salmon are these amazing beings that are born to a river, and when they are born to that river, they, as little fry, little tiny guys, they make a journey, and they make a journey down the rivers. And as they make their journey down the rivers, they start to get bigger. If they don't get eaten by other things along the way, those that make it get to our delta, this amazing, beautiful, miraculous place that is the lungs and waterway of this side of the world, that they get to that delta area and it starts to get salty, and they hang out there and they become saltwater fish. They move from being freshwater fish to saltwater fish. And after they're hanging out in the delta for a while, they come through our bay and out to the ocean. And before they go out to the ocean for 4 years, they actually don't go north first, they go south. And they go south during the time when the whales are birthing their babies. And many of them give up their lives so that those birthing moms can have nutrients for those new babies that they've birthed. And then those that make it back go north for about 4 years. And then something tells them to come home. That in our belief system is that the Creator has given them this sense that they are supposed to go home. And so they make their journey home. Those that haven't been fished and those that haven't been eaten by whales and other animals, they make their way home, and they come through the ocean and through our bay and up to our delta. And they do another thing. And they hang out in the delta and they transform their whole self. Their faces actually grow a hook, and they go from being saltwater fish to freshwater fish again. And as they make their way home up their river, not any river, but only the river they were born to, as they're going up against currents, they're moving those rocks on the bottoms of those rivers and clearing the water for us that we drink. And some of them pass away and they die, or they get eaten by bears as they get higher up, and their carcasses are on the sides of the rivers and they're feeding their nitrogen into the soil to feed those trees that give us oxygen to breathe. Those that get all the way up to the top, some of them get fished by fishermen, but those that make it up to the top, their very river that they were born to, they lay eggs and then they give up their lives. All of that stuff is done for us, our health as human beings. We get the benefit of eating salmon, of drinking that fresh water out of the rivers that they're cleaning with their bodies, to breathe the air that they've given their bodies to nourish the trees that give us oxygen. And so these salmon are amazing creatures that give themselves for us because they live in reciprocity. And what we do is that we dam up the rivers and make it too warm for them to make their journey, or not allow enough water to come out into the rivers so that they can make their journey whole. And as they start, their bodies start to, or their relations start to diminish, there means smaller amounts of them are here, then we know that we're also in trouble as human beings. There used to be 4 runs of salmon that came through. Now we're down to 2. And many times we hear that the fishermen aren't allowed to actually to fish as many salmon anymore. And salmon prices get really high. And it's because of human beings doing things that are not in reciprocity with the rest of the world, and thinking of ourselves as more than a salmon who doesn't have a human voice. The Winnemem Wintu believe that it's their job to be the voice of the salmon, and that there was a story that Cowling tells about how she knew that it was her job to do this work in a different kind of way. That on the top of Mount Shasta, there was a glacier there, and their elders said that the salmon would go away one day, and they would go through that glacier. And one day they would return, but that we would have to figure out how to help them do that. And Colleen began to search and figure out how to do that, because the Shasta Dam had been put up and the salmon had not come home in a long time. And so she heard about, when the Shasta Dam was put up, that scientists gathered a whole bunch of little fry, and they took them all the way to New Zealand. And that these little tiny salmon fish were in New Zealand, the relatives to the ones that actually were in the river, the McLeod River, that there was no salmon run in this part of New Zealand, and that the New Zealand government wanted to do that. And so the United States helped them by giving them these salmon there. When the Maori people from New Zealand heard about Colleen's work, they said, "We have your salmon here and we'd like to give them back." And so she made a journey to their river that the salmon had been put into. And the Maori people met her and cleared a space along the riverbank for them to dance and have their traditional dance. And when she got to that faraway land, she looked up and there was a mountain there. And in that mountain was the glacier, the same kind of glacier that was at Mount Shasta. That those salmon had gone from Mount Shasta to the mountain over there in New Zealand, and that these salmon need to come home now. For 8 years, we have been a part of the Run for Salmon, which is happening currently. My daughter is up there right now, and they're paddling all the way down from the McLeod River down to the bay. We started that 4 years of the salmon from here in the bay going up. Then we're doing 4 years coming down. Through those prayers, we have had people from all walks of life that have joined us on these prayer ceremonies for a mile, or for a prayer, or for a dance, or for food, to share food together, reminding people of our relationship and this very fragile time that we're in, and how important these salmon are to all of us. And so as we hit this fourth year of this 8-year journey, this fourth year coming down, seems like no matter where I am, there's a train that goes by and honks. As we're hitting this last 4 years, there's something miraculous that happened, that the Wildlife, Fishing, Game, and Forestry Department has worked with Chief Kellingsis and the Winnemem-Wintu to figure out how to bring those salmon up over the Shasta Dam, to repopulate them and to figure out how to bring the salmon home. And so this prayer works, that when we talk about indigenous epistemologies and indigenous work and how do we save the planet, this is how we do it. We do it all together as one group of human beings, trying to figure out how to fix the wrongs that we have done in a very short amount of time. So we invite you all to be a part of the Run for Salmon, to follow it along. We're still doing very strict COVID protocols because there's lots of elders and our tribes are small. And so follow along on Instagram and on Facebook and to find out what's happening there. There's a curriculum for young people that has been developed about salmon that people can tie into, to take it to your young people, to summer camps, to students that are starting school in August. And there will be ceremonies, and we worked, of course, together with our good friend who has been a part of this for 8 years, and that's Kumu Hua Case, who we have also worked closely with to save their and protect their sacred mountain, Mauna Kea in Hawaii, who also has to deal with water, because their mountain there is where the mountain, where the snow hits, because the peak is so high, but also where the water comes down, the fresh water from the spring comes down to actually give water to everyone that is on those islands. And so it's important for us to continue to protect them. They will be doing a kukulu event, and you can find that on the Facebook pages as well, where they will be celebrating the work that people have done across the world to protect Mauna Kea, and connecting Chief Kellingsis' work with the salmon and our work here in the Bay Area to protect sacred sites. And I think I'm going to be done right now.
Wow, you brought tears to my eyes. Thank you so much. That was so beautiful. I learned so much about salmon. I love salmon, and I have a much more respect for the beautiful creature right now. Thank you so much, Karina. That was amazing. So everybody give her an applause.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much. That was so beautiful.
Thank
And what a
you.
wonderful way to start our day. Oh my goodness. So thank you. We're gonna continue on as soon as I get my act together here. Okay. So next up, and thank you for being on time and everything, Karina. I definitely want to go to a salmon run. I can't wait. Anyway, the next thing we have going on here today is sea level rise, groundwater rise, and adaptation for the San Francisco Bay shoreline with Ellen Plain, who's an environmental scientist, resilient landscapes program from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. So thank you, Ellen, for being here. Thank you. And you can get started. Jack, do you want to just highlight her and take me off? Thank you.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Cheryl, and thanks for the wonderful presentation, Karina. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And as Cheryl mentioned, my presentation today is going to focus on the topic of sea level rise adaptation here in the San Francisco Bay Area. I'm going to give a kind of a wide-ranging overview here about some of the challenges we face and some of the adaptation opportunities we have. And then I look forward to hearing from my fellow speakers a bit more about some of those challenges and opportunities. So first, I'll start off by just giving a brief overview of some of the factors that I see as contributing to the sea level rise adaptation challenge here in the San Francisco Bay Area. So the first one I'm going to cover is the development history. So the way that we've developed the shoreline here has really contributed to some of the vulnerability that we have to flooding, and I'll go into why that is. Next, I'll talk a bit about elevation and how important elevation of the land is when we think about vulnerability and adaptation to sea level rise. The third issue is the history of inequality and making sure that our adaptation plans consider equity and center equity is a huge challenge that we face. Another one is thinking about water coming from different angles. And so when we think about sea level rise, we tend to think about water coming in from the bay, but there's also a lot of other sources of flooding that can interact with that flooding from the bay that we need to consider to make sure that we're making smart adaptation decisions. And then the fifth one I'll cover is this, what I call many cooks in the kitchen issue of the lots of different overlapping jurisdictions and how that can inhibit decision-making and some ideas we have about how to have a more productive adaptation planning process. So the first one I'll get into here is development history. And so like many other estuaries around the world, San Francisco Bay has had a lot of development in our wetlands. And so historically, there were vast swaths of tidal marshes and mudflats ringing the San Francisco Bay. Around the mid-19th century, there started to be a lot of development in those marshes. Land became really valuable and scarce, and we started to expand out into the bay to fill the bay and put housing and commercial development, industry, agricultural land, salt ponds, all kinds of different things out into what we call the baylands, or the area that's affected by the tides at intertidal elevation. So that's these tidal marshes and mudflats that you may be familiar with. And so the image that we're looking at here is the San Mateo County shoreline. I've added a green line there to show sort of the extent of the historical tidal marshes in this area. You can see on the left side, that's the Bear Island tidal marsh restoration. It used to be diked off and separated from the bay, and it's since been restored to tidal marsh. And then we're also looking at Redwood City and Foster City, a couple examples of some development projects that extended far out into the bay and built up on those historical tidal marshes. And that happened all over the Bay Area. So looking at a map of the extent here, we're looking at the whole San Francisco estuary. So from the Sacramento, San Joaquin Delta over here, all the way out to the Golden Gate over here, you can see the historical extent of tidal marshes around 1800 before all that development occurred. And the reason that it's important when we're thinking about sea level rise to understand tidal marshes is that tidal marshes play a really essential function in buffering our shorelines from flooding. And in particular, when you get a storm surge or waves coming into the shoreline, tidal marshes can actually attenuate those waves. They can spread out the flooding, slow down the waves, reduce the energy. And so you get less shoreline erosion and fewer flooding impacts. And so one of the reasons that it's an issue that we've developed so many marshes is that we've lost that benefit that they provide. And so looking at a modern map here, you can see the remaining tidal marshes that we have in red. At the lowest point, about 90% of the tidal marshes have been lost in this area. We've since improved that. So since about the 80s or so, we've been restoring a lot of tidal marshes. So busting down the levees that separated them from the bay, allowing those tidal floodwaters back in, and allowing those marshes to naturally regenerate. So just to give you a sense of what some of these areas were used for, on the left, again, we have the historical mapping. On the right is the modern. You can see across the North Bay, there's a lot of agricultural areas, a lot of diked marshes used for duck hunting clubs, those sorts of uses. In the Central Bay, it's mostly that urban development, like that picture we were looking at of Foster City shoreline. And then in the South Bay, a lot of the development for salt ponds. And a lot of those salt ponds are no longer in production and are being restored as tidal marshes or as managed ponds through the South Bay Salt Pond Restoration Project, the largest tidal marsh restoration project on the West Coast. And so that's just to give you a sense of sort of what the different areas along the shoreline are used for today. And all of those come with sort of different opportunities and challenges when it comes to adaptation. So the second issue that I had laid out was this issue of land being at or near or even below sea level. And so a lot of those places around the North Bay that I was just showing you that have been used for agriculture, like in this image that we're seeing here, those areas have subsided quite a bit below sea level. And so what happens when you build a dike or a levee to keep the water out, and you keep these historical marsh soils dry and they're exposed to the air, that organic matter decomposes and it causes the land to sink. And so a lot of those areas are actually quite a bit below sea level today. And that adds some adaptation challenges, because if this levee were to be compromised and the floodwaters get in, you get much deeper flooding in that area. Another challenge is in terms of restoration. So if we were to intentionally bust a hole in that levee and try to restore that area to tidal marsh, right now it's not high enough elevation for that marsh to establish. And with sea level rise, it's even harder for tidal marshes to establish. And so one of the big challenges we have is making sure that we can restore in a smart way, so that those tidal marshes can actually have a chance of restoring and regenerating. And there's a lot of different ideas how to do that. I could give a whole presentation about that topic, so I won't get too much into it today. But for example, one of the ways that we've been doing this is by taking the sediment that gets dredged out of navigation channels in the bay, placing that sediment in these low-lying subsided areas before they're restored. And then you can have a higher elevation starting point for those tidal marshes. So that's one topic there, is those really subsided areas. But not everywhere was developed this way, where you build a levee and then dry out the area on the inside. In a lot of other places, we actually just placed fill, so like old rubble, trash, you name it, out into the bay to create new land, and place that on top of the tidal marshes. And often it was filled up to just above the high tide line. And with sea level rise, that means that those areas that were not built very high above the water are especially vulnerable to sea level rise. The next issue we have is the history of inequality. So like other climate impacts, the impacts of flooding from sea level rise are not evenly distributed across communities around the Bay Area. And so one example we're looking at here, this is the East Bay shoreline, the historical redlining map. And as you can see here, this historical redlining map and other racist housing practices mean that marginalized communities are more likely to live in these areas along the shoreline, places that are more low-lying, more prone to flooding, and also tend to be more contaminated. And so developing adaptation strategies that are equitable and address this disproportionate risk is a big challenge that we have. I mentioned on the last slide about the fact that a lot of these areas exposed to flooding are also former industrial sites. A lot of them have legacy soil contaminants. This is a map from the Toxic Tides Project showing some of the sites along that East Bay shoreline that have been identified as contaminated areas that are exposed to flooding from sea level rise or projected to be flooded in the future. I won't go too much into this topic because our friends at Baykeeper are going to be giving a presentation on this next, but just wanted to highlight that topic. The next issue we have is the water coming from all sides. And so when we're thinking about sea level rise, I mentioned, we often think about water levels rising in the bay, that water moving in toward the shoreline, overtopping the shoreline and causing flooding. And that certainly is a challenge. But we also need to think about water coming from other angles. So as we saw in this past winter, storm events are becoming increasingly intense with climate change. We're getting a lot of heavy rainfall events. And so that can be another contributor to flooding challenges. Another contributor is rising groundwater. And these two challenges are not always incorporated into the sea level rise models that we're using to develop our plans. So here's a little figure here showing these different sources of flooding. So we have sea level rise on the left side. So global sea level, storm surge, tides, those are the things that determine the water levels in the bay. I talked a bit about those intense rainfall events. You can have a lot more water coming down from above. When those rainfall events happen, the water collects in the upper watersheds and moves down through into the lower areas, which tend to be where our cities are, our more developed areas. And then we also have this issue of groundwater rise. And so most people don't realize it, but there's actually a connection underground between ocean water levels and groundwater levels. And when I'm talking about groundwater here, I'm talking about a different layer of groundwater than what Karina was talking about in the Central Valley, those deep aquifers that have really been pumped out and depleted over the years for water supply purposes. What I'm talking about is the water table. So when the rain comes down from the sky, sinks into the ground, just that upper saturated surface level. If you've ever dug a deep hole and hit that wet ground, that's the type of groundwater that we're talking about here. And as sea levels rise and they move inland, you can see there's an interface between that saline groundwater and the fresh groundwater. As that interface moves farther inland, it causes groundwater levels to rise. And so this is a secondary impact of sea level rise that also needs to be considered in our planning. So thinking about depth to groundwater is one of the topics that I've spent a lot of time looking at in my research. So I'm just going to show you a few examples from some recent work that I have done with Pathways Climate Institute and UC Berkeley. We've been working to expand the level of knowledge about where our groundwater tables are today and how they're likely to rise with sea level rise. And so I'm just showing a map here of the existing depth to water around the bay shoreline. You can see the areas in purple are the areas that are marked as emergent. So areas with emergent groundwater where the level of the groundwater is at or above the ground surface. And those are really freshwater wetlands is what we're talking about, or seasonal wetlands. And so you can see some of those areas up here in the Novato area. If you've ever driven by on Highway 37 during the winter, you may have seen those flooded. Those are seasonal wetland areas. We're also identifying areas like here at the Oakland Airport where they do pumping because they have emergent groundwater. So you can see so some of those places where it's most shallow. We also identify sort of the depth below the ground surface for areas that do not have emergent groundwater. And then we also project future conditions with sea level rise. And so you can see how much the area exposed to emergent groundwater expands as we increase the level of the sea level rise in our model. And really, when you think about emergent groundwater here, groundwater levels tend to fluctuate a lot with precipitation, and they're much higher in the winter. And so how we're likely to see these groundwater rise impacts occur is that those areas that are wet and soggy in the winter, they're going to be wetter and soggier for longer, and the areas where they are wet are going to expand. And so it'll start out as a seasonal impact, and then eventually, as sea levels continue to rise, maybe some of those areas will continue to be wet throughout the year. We also look not only at emergent groundwater, but shallow groundwater, because there's a lot of infrastructure around the Bay Area that was built assuming that that ground would be dry. But because we're no longer living in a static climate, a lot of places that were assumed to be dry are going to be more and more wet in the future. And in fact, they already are more and more wet. And so we're starting to see impacts all around the bay of impacts on basements, roadbeds, buried utilities, water seeping into wastewater and stormwater sewer pipes, these types of things. And so understanding where groundwater not only is emergent, but where it's shallow under these various sea level rise scenarios is really important for planning purposes. So I don't have time to get into all the details today, but if you're interested in learning more about this, we have a wide variety of resources available to you on our website, and I'll be happy to drop the link into the chat after my presentation. You can read the report. There's a story map that explains how all these processes work. All of the data is available for download, and you can check out the web maps that we have created as well on this issue. I will note that we've only completed the mapping for 4 counties at this time: Alameda, Marin, San Mateo, and San Francisco. We are currently working on Contra Costa County, and we're working to expand to all 9 Bay Area counties as well. The next issue I'll touch on briefly is this issue of many cooks in the kitchen. You know, a lot of our planning is done at the jurisdictional scale of a city or a county. But if one city decides to protect itself and put up a seawall, that water is just going to come in around the edges of the seawall if they're not working with their neighbors next door. And so this is really an issue where we need to be working together and thinking as a group and as a region about how to adapt. One of SFEI's key contributions on this topic has been the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Adaptation Atlas. And one of the things that the Atlas does is identify what's called operational landscape units. And those are sort of more geographic and physical units, primarily based on watersheds, where it makes sense to do adaptation planning at a scale that works with nature, it works with the landscape. And there's 30 of those around the Bay Area, and several of them already have adaptation working groups starting up. So that's very exciting to see. The Adaptation Atlas also identifies areas that are suitable for different types of nature-based shoreline adaptation. And that can be really useful as folks try to figure out what the range of actual options are, what things are physically possible given the wind and waves and tide and the type of shoreline in your area. So that's another great resource to check out, adaptationatlas.sfei.org. When I talk about nature-based adaptation, I'm really talking about types of shoreline adaptation that work with nature. So as opposed to a levee or a seawall, which is a static piece of infrastructure, things that work with nature, and nature can adapt with sea level rise. So sediment can accumulate on a marsh, marshes can move upland and inland with sea level rise. Same goes for mudflats. These types of natural features are not going to stay in one place and remain the same. They'll move and adapt with the tides. And so working with them rather than against them can be a really valuable strategy. I've just listed out some of the nature-based adaptation strategies that we look at in the Adaptation Atlas on this slide. And again, Save the Bay is going to be talking more about nature-based adaptation, so we'll get into that in a later presentation. I also want to note that hybrid solutions, or what we call gray/green solutions, are really key. I'm showing a photo here of the Sears Point tidal marsh restoration up in the North Bay. And you can see they needed to construct what's called a setback levee to protect infrastructure behind their restoration site. But even though they needed to put in that levee, they were able to restore a huge amount of tidal marsh. And in fact, they wouldn't have been able to do it without the levee. They also included this gentle, what's called an ecotone slope, which provides a lot of wildlife benefits, in addition to attenuating waves and preventing them from eroding the levee. So those are the types of solutions that we are likely need to be thinking about in many places around the Bay. How can we maximize the benefits of both of those types of infrastructure to achieve multiple benefits for people and communities, as well as wildlife and ecosystems in the Bay? The stage of work that we're involved in now is really applying the lessons learned from the Adaptation Atlas. So we've been working with a lot of these local groups to identify opportunities for nature-based solutions. We've worked in many communities around the North Bay, Petaluma, Sonoma watersheds. We're starting to work in Novato Creek watershed as well. In the Central Bay, this photo on the right is from work with the San Leandro Bay, Oakland Alameda Estuary Working Group, one of the OLU working groups that's making great strides. We've also worked in the South Bay along the Sunnyvale shoreline, many areas where folks are trying to do nature-based and hybrid adaptation strategies and looking for guidance on how to do that. So I'll end my presentation here. I just want to quickly summarize some of the lessons that I think are important as we're considering adaptation strategies. So I think, the events of this week and this year and all the years to come are really emphasizing the urgency. All of you know that this is a climate emergency and we really need to speed up the scale of adaptation. Designing with nature is really key because nature is adaptable and dynamic, and it provides more benefits to use nature-based adaptation strategies for people and for the Bay. Working across jurisdictions rather than within jurisdictions is really key to develop the most productive and efficient solutions. We need to empower and center communities who are most at risk as we develop these adaptation strategies. And finally, we need to be really creative. We don't have all the tools that we're going to need to solve this problem yet, and we constantly are innovating and trying to add more. And it's essential that we do that in order to develop the best adaptation solutions that we can. So I'll go ahead and stop there and pass it back to you, Cheryl. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present to the group today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was another amazing presentation. I appreciate all that you do for us and the world and our shorelines. Thank you so much. Well, next, we're going to have toxic sites creating toxic futures with Unde Mevoli. She's the field investigator and policy advocate. And Julia Dowell, she's also a field investigator and community advocate for San Francisco Bay Keeper. So thank you both for being here.
Thanks so much, Cheryl, for having us. And hello to you all. So thanks,
Jack,
Julia.
you want to highlight them, please?
All right. So good morning, everyone. Julia Dowell and I will be talking to you a bit about toxic sites and how sea level rise and groundwater inundation can pose a threat to contaminated lands. And Cheryl just introduced us, but again, I'm Andi Mavoli, field investigator and policy advocate for San Francisco Baykeeper, and Julia is a field investigator and community advocate also at San Francisco Baykeeper. Next slide, please. In our talk, we will cover how many toxic sites are projected to be prone or are currently prone to sea level rise and or groundwater inundation. We're not going to go into too much detail about sea level rise and groundwater impacts because you just heard an amazing talk by Ellen. And then we'll talk a bit about the regulatory agencies who oversee and create remediation strategies for toxic sites. Then we'll talk a bit about Baykeeper's advocacy strategies regarding sea level rise and toxic sites. And lastly, we'll share some current sites that we're working on. Next slide, please. So there are over 1,100 toxic shoreline sites throughout the Bay Area. And many of these sites are disproportionately located near vulnerable communities burdened by environmental injustice that will bear heavier consequences of climate change and sea level rise than others. Next slide, please. This is a map of San Francisco Bay, and it's under about 4.9 feet or 150 centimeters of sea level rise. And there's also a 100-year storm event added on to that. And so you can see here these green and red dots on these map. These indicate open and closed toxic sites found in the Department of Toxic Substance Control's EnviroStore and the Water Board's GeoTracker sites. So you can just see how many of these sites will be affected by sea level rise or groundwater inundation under this specific scenario. Next slide, please. Sea level rise can and will inundate toxic sites around the Bay's shoreline. According to the Ocean Protection Council, sea level rise is expected to be anywhere between 2.5 to 6.9 feet. And the California Coastal Commission states the coast faces a significant risk with 1 foot by 2030 and 7.6 feet by 2100. In addition, groundwater rise is also a secondary impact from sea level rise, and it is often overlooked, especially when it comes to planning departments. As sea level rise increases, the groundwater table of freshwater also increases. This can lead to increased flooding further inland than with just sea level rise alone. Therefore, to get accurate risk of flooding, sea level rise and groundwater must be evaluated together. According to the San Francisco Estuary Institute, to avoid maladaptation, sea level rise adaptation efforts must consider the potential for groundwater rise. So Julia is going to continue talking a little bit about remediation strategies.
Thanks so much, Andi. It's great to be here, everyone. Yeah, so who are the agencies that oversee the cleanup of toxic sites around the Bay? There's 3 main agencies I want to talk about. The Department of Toxic Substances Control is the first, the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and in the San Francisco Bay, we are part of the Region 2 of that board. And the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, they mainly oversee Superfund sites, which are considered the most contaminated sites in the country. Sometimes multiple agencies will work on a site, but there's usually an assigned lead agency that's one of the 3 I mentioned. For example, this screenshot here is from the Treasure Island Naval Station. And for the cleanup of that site, DTSC, the Water Board, and US EPA are all involved, but DTSC is the lead agency. So there are many different types of remediation strategies. We won't get into all the different possible remediation strategies today, but there are many different types that are used to clean up toxic sites, and which remediation strategy is picked depends largely on what kinds of contaminants are found at the site, the past and future land use of the site, and many other factors. However, one factor that is only just starting to be considered in the cleanup of toxic sites is sea level rise and associated groundwater rise. I wanted to share a quote from BCDC's Adapting to Rising Tides report, because I think it really sums up the issue that we're talking about today. So it says cleanup standards for contaminated sites vary, and if an upland site becomes aquatic as sea levels rise, it will not have been remediated to a high enough standard. And I like to think about a high enough standard to protect communities and the bay. So DTSC is starting to consider sea level rise in its remediation strategies. In February 2023, DTSC released its first ever draft sea level rise guidance to project managers for cleanup activities. While this document has a lot of benefits, it offers guidance for incorporating sea level rise projections into site remediation. It's important to note that it does not require sea level rise or groundwater rise to be addressed in a site's remediation plan. It's more suggestive. I also want to highlight that this is a draft document, and DTSC is currently accepting public comments on this document through October of this year. And I want to briefly talk about our work in community advocacy on this issue. So Baykeeper is part of a coalition called the San Francisco Bay Shoreline Contamination Cleanup Coalition. This coalition has been active for over 2 years. And our mission is to mobilize for the safe, comprehensive, and immediate cleanup of all toxic and radioactive contamination near the San Francisco Bay shoreline, where sea level rise due to the climate crisis will spread contamination. This coalition is made up of 16 organizations from around the Bay, and these include environmental, grassroots, and environmental justice organizations. This is a really awesome organization or coalition. And if you want to learn more, our website is sfbayshorelineccc.org. And now I will pass it back to Andi to talk about our general plan advocacy.
Thanks so much, Julia. A well-developed general plan can offset the risk of climate change impacts and create an adaptable, resilient community where residents, businesses, and the environment all thrive. Therefore, Baykeeper engages with local governments to strengthen general plan language. Some of our language surrounds topics like encouraging new development or redevelopment outside of current or projected floodplains, identifying contaminated lands estimated to flood under various sea level rise scenarios, evaluating the suitability and the safety of redeveloping on those contaminated lands, and prioritizing the use of nature-based solutions whenever possible. Next slide, please. So Julie and I are both going to talk about some areas that we're working on currently throughout the Bay. One of them is the Baywalk development, which is proposed in Pittsburgh, and the other one is AstraZeneca, which is a proposed development in Richmond. So I'll talk about Baywalk. Next slide, please. So this is the Baywalk development. This is a site that was formerly a power generating station for the past 70 years. PG&E has owned it, Mirant has owned it, and now the developer, Integral, has ownership of the land. So some contaminants of concern that are here are total petroleum hydrocarbons, polynuclear aromatic hydrocarbons, VOCs, arsenic, lead, mercury, and other various metals. And these are all in the soil, and they're in the groundwater, and they're in the soil vapor. So this land currently is subjected to flooding. This is a picture at the top that we took with our drone, and you can just see how sort of inundated the land is. This was during the king tides on January 21st of this year. But the other thing that this land is subjected to is it has peat soil. And so therefore it it has caught on fire 3 times. And then again, like we just talked about, there's contamination in the soil, groundwater, and soil vapor. So there will be this site is going to have 3 phases of development, and the project is expected to have almost 2,000 residential units. There's going to be an employment center, a mixed-use development, a hotel, park, and then open space. And then there's a link at the bottom of this slide if you want to learn more about the proposed development, which is a link to the notice of preparation for the environmental impact report. Next slide, please. So I just want you to kind of look at their plan for the development, and I really want you to focus more on sort of this bottom part here that is that like burnt orange color, and then off to the left over here where the rest of sort of that development is, because the next 2 slides will be sort of pictures of that exact area. So can you go to the next slide, please? Thanks, Juliet. So in this first picture here, this is our drone footage, and you're looking at, so you can see the power station in the distance, and these are the burn scars that were there from the peat soil fire that happened in October, the last one, October of 2022. And then on the other side, again, this is our footage from our drone at the king tides of this past year in January. And you can just see how inundated sort of the area is. And these 2 areas, one going towards the power station and the other going the opposite direction, just in terms of sort of vantage point. This is called the operable unit A, which will be their first phase of development. And there will be over almost 700 units placed here, residential units. Next slide, please. So this is just one of, those 1,100 sites around the Bay. And planning departments and even regulatory agencies are okay with housing people on contaminated lands without proper cleanup. In the notice of preparation of the environmental impact report, it states that construction and occupancy of one development phase area may take place prior to the completion of remediation in other development phase areas, and prior to the completion of remediation in the undeveloped area and the former cooling water canal. This is a really risky move because we have not taken into account that this is currently a flooded site. So the ability for contaminants to mobilize can be high, and it may not make that area or that land safe to be living on anymore. So I'm going to pass it over to Julia to do the next site.
Thanks, Andi. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about another site that we've been working on for a while now, and this is the AstraZeneca site in Richmond. So this site was a former chemical, fertilizer, and pesticide manufacturing plant for over 100 years. It was previously owned by the Stauffer Chemical Company, and then it was owned by Zeneca Inc. And currently it contains 550,000 cubic yards of hazardous waste. Some of the known contaminants at the site include arsenic, beryllium, cadmium, copper, lead, mercury, nickel, selenium, zinc, PCBs, DDT, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, VOCs, and many, many more. There's actually a really long list of contaminants at this site, given the different types of manufacturing that were done. Currently, in 2021, the Richmond City Council voted to approve 4,000 residential units on this site without considering the emerging risks posed by sea level rise to the site. I'll note here that for these residential units, there are plans to do some cleanup, but there's, as part of that cleanup, a lot of that includes leaving waste in place and capping it over, which we don't feel is very effective when you have sea level rise and groundwater rise impacts that are highly likely to occur, and mobilize contaminants. So I want to highlight a couple groups that have been working on this site for decades in some cases. The Richmond Shoreline Alliance and the Richmond Southeast Shoreline Community Advisory Group have been fighting for a comprehensive cleanup of the Zeneca site for decades and are continuing to fight this proposed development on the site unless there is adequate remediation of the site. So those are just two sites that we're following and advocating for a comprehensive cleanup of. And I want to thank you all so much for listening to our presentation today. Andi and I will be here to answer questions, and this is our contact information. Thank you so much. And with that, I will pass it back to Cheryl.
Thank you, Julia and Andi. That was really, really great. Kind of sad and depressing, but you know, that's the world we live in, right? We got to do what we can do, and you're doing it a lot. So thank you so much for enlightening us on the toxicity of our future. But, you know, hopefully, yeah, I know it's like when I was on council, I was trying to get the council to send a letter about the development in Richmond to the Richmond City Council, but Berkeley City Council didn't want to do that, sadly. But anyway, but next up, thank you so much. We're going to have nature-based solutions for flood resilience with Haley Courier, who is the policy manager at San Francisco Save the Bay. And I also want to mention that San Francisco Baykeeper and San Francisco Save the Bay are recipients, as well as Cheryl and the city of Berkeley for our climate work, but are recipients of the UNA Association, United Nations Association of the East Bay Global Citizens Awards. So congratulations on that. We're in company together, yay. So take it away, Haley.
Great, thank you so much. Let's see, oops. Share screen. All right. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Haley Courier, and I'm one of the policy managers at Save the Bay. And I'll be talking about nature-based flood resilience and how cities can prepare for the extreme storm events that are coming as part of climate change. But first, a little bit about Save the Bay. Founded in 1961, Save the Bay is the largest regional organization working to protect and restore the San Francisco Bay for people and wildlife. And we do that in three ways. We have our restoration work out on the shoreline. We're helping with some of that wetland restoration that Ellen was talking about. Scientists and policymakers have identified that we need at least 100,000 acres of tidal marsh to remain a healthy and thriving estuary. And as part of our sea level rise protection plan, we're at over 55,000 acres restored and 25,000 acres in the process, and Save the Bay's restoration work is part of that. We also have an education program where we bring young people and community groups to the shoreline to learn about the importance of the shoreline and the tidal marshes and help do some of that restoration work. And then we have our policy advocacy team, and that's my team, and we focus on both pollution prevention and climate resilience. And in looking at climate change and climate resilience, we are also looking at the risk of flooding from all sides. Sea level rise, groundwater rise, and stormwater flooding from intensifying storms. We know that all of these are, what we see now is only going to get worse, and those impacts are going to combine. And so we are really interested to understand how we can address those risks with nature-based solutions, because nature-based solutions are often more resilient and sometimes even more cost-effective than more traditional infrastructure approaches. And the thing about nature-based solutions is that they provide all these other benefits for communities. Gray infrastructure often just does that one thing that we build it for. Nature-based solutions provides all these other combined benefits that are going to help us help make cities and the whole Bay Area more resilient into the future. And I really appreciate the landscape setting that Ellen did about these issues. And and while all these flood risks do need to be planned together, I'm going to focus a little bit more on nature-based solutions for intensifying storms. So anyone who lived in California this winter is quite familiar with the intensity of storms that we're facing now and will continue to face into the future. Warmer temperatures lead to bigger, wetter storms. So we have more water falling in a shorter amount of time, which gives less time for water to be moved safely through our system or percolate into the ground and away from people in the built environment, which is what causes flooding and all of this damage. So the loss of life, the damage to homes and infrastructure, the disruption of daily life that we saw this winter, it was unprecedented. And it's only the beginning of what climate change promises to deliver. In between, of course, lengthening deep and deepening droughts. I really resonate with this weather whiplash term. And of course, these impacts are not felt at all equally. Low-income communities, communities of color, people with disabilities, people with other impacted, people feeling the combination of impacts will feel the impacts of climate change and flooding more acutely. So just in case, just to really drive home the urgency of storms and why flood resilience from storms is really important, what we saw this winter and what we see in other places around the country, around the world, and we're going to continue to see, is that access to hospitals and schools and other essential facilities were blocked or impassable due to damaged roads or halted transit systems. At least 178 schools in the state were shut down for some length of time due to flooding this year. As if we didn't have enough disruptions to education in the past few years, flooding is yet another way that we're disrupting the education of our children. Over 6,000 residents were told to evacuate from their homes. Evacuations not just for wildfires. Dozens died in storms across the state this year, including unhoused people and children. The impacts on unhoused people is another way that the ways that multiple oppressions will make the impacts of climate change worse. We also saw billions of dollars of property damage reported, both public land, public property, private property. And when homes don't have flood insurance, or when that flood insurance doesn't cover the type of damage that people received, we really see the economic impact of flooding on individuals as well. People's inside of people's homes were damaged, their furniture, their carpet, there's mold. I actually personally know people who were displaced from their homes from mold. There's structural damage. And while, of course, these impacts are difficult and concerning for everyone, we also know that these kinds of expenses and disruptions are catastrophic for those that are living on the edge financially. Any unexpected expense like this, with possibly lost days of work, having to move homes, could mean losing your home and losing the sort of stability that people have built, maybe just on the edge of building. And according to the EPA, actually these annual damage costs caused by flooding are projected to increase by 30% by 2100. And I just point that out because the impacts of climate change are only going to get worse and more expensive. The current moment is actually the cheapest moment we're ever going to have to prepare ourselves for the coming impacts of climate change. So at Save the Bay, we're working to ensure that cities are looking at flooding comprehensively because the causes of storm flooding are multifaceted. First, and largely, and not entirely, but largely because of the difficulties actually funding infrastructure in this country, and especially in the state due to our restrictive tax laws, existing stormwater systems are degraded and barely up to the task of managing the old normal storms, let alone the new normal storms. Most drainage infrastructure was constructed before the 1940s. These are real old pipes. And actually the ASCE's infrastructure report card gave California a D+ grade on our stormwater infrastructure, not something to be proud of and something to be quite concerned about. So these systems are really degraded and need to be maintained and just fixed so that they can even function as intended. But beyond that, the stormwater system that we have isn't actually big enough to handle the storms that confront us now and that will continue to worsen in the future. So with more water falling in a shorter amount of time, you need more space to collect that water and manage it so that it keeps out of harm's way. And the system we have is just not up to that task. And then third, but just if we expand those pipes and detention basins and culverts, that is actually not going to be sufficient for the scale of the problem that we face with intensifying storms. That gray infrastructure, that's the pipes and the culverts, will only serve to do this one thing, move waterway as quickly as possible. But if we think about green infrastructure and green and nature-based solutions to this flooding, we get all these other benefits that make our cities more resilient to all the types of hazards that we face. And then finally, we really need municipalities to be mapping and addressing flooding beyond riparian zones. Of course, on the shoreline, riparian zones along creeks, but also how the stormwater system is leading to flooding across the watershed. And then we need cities to understand how these multiple risks are intersecting for communities at the water's edge and throughout the watershed. For example, with sea level rise and groundwater rise, that's actually going to back up our stormwater systems, our stormwater pipes that empty out into the bay, making water even harder to drain and causing even more flooding. We need to make sure cities understand these risks so they can be addressing them comprehensively. So, just as wetland restoration, and Ellen talked about this, is a nature-based solution or a nature-based approach to protect us from sea level rise, we also need nature-based approaches to address stormwater flooding. So this is the wetland restoration nature-based approach for sea level rise. If we have, for example, a wastewater treatment plant that's on the coastline that's at risk of sea level rise, a traditional gray approach might be a seawall and hardened protection, just build up higher and build higher than the water is the goal. A nature-based approach might be a horizontal levee, like we have in this image, which restores tidal marsh, creating more habitat, but that gives a lot of space to absorb sea level rise and storm surge, and also actually improves the water quality of the the water treatment effluent that's coming from the wastewater treatment plant into the water. So it's providing all these multiple benefits, and actually is more resilient in the long term with all the unpredictability that we face versus a more a gray approach of a seawall. So what are nature-based solutions to storm flooding? In general, nature-based solutions to storm flooding are more natural permeable spaces anywhere we can fit them. Open space protection is an example of nature-based solution to flooding. Protecting our open space is an important part of flood resilience. It helps absorb water into the ground, ensuring that less water is rushing over asphalt into urban areas, which causes overtopping of rivers, overextension of our stormwater systems. You might have heard of a Coyote Valley south of San Jose. Protecting Coyote Valley is actually part of protecting San Jose from flooding, because all that open space can then collect stormwater, absorb it into the ground before it rushes all into the city of San Jose and then into people's homes. Floodplain restoration and protection and development setbacks from the riparian zone, and then also restored riparian areas and riparian corridors is also a natural way to manage flooding. When we let rivers overtop their banks, as they do in natural systems, it keeps the water out of developments and then out of harm's way. And then the third type of nature-based solution or nature-based adaptation to stormwater flooding is green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI. That's a mouthful. Which is a specific approach to urban design. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. So what is green stormwater infrastructure, or GSI, also known as green infrastructure or a low impact development? There's lots of terms for this, but generally what we're talking about is the use of plants, soil systems, permeable surfaces, and substrates to manage, absorb, and filter stormwater. We might have seen them, there's a bunch of different ways that they present. Rain gardens and bioswales. This is a picture of Lake Merritt, Snow Park at Lake Merritt. It's kind of a park scale approach. The urban tree canopy is part of this, integrating into park spaces. Green schoolyards are another way, permeable pavements. These are all examples of using our natural systems to manage stormwater and reduce pollution. We love that they do both. And so, we save the bay, but also lots of people love green stormwater infrastructure because it's a multi-benefit approach. Again, while gray infrastructure, pipes and catch basins and culverts do manage flooding, that's what it's built for, and it's been doing that for 60, 70, 80 years. Actually, we have thousands of years of people using these to manage flooding. That's all it does. It's a one-trick pony. Green stormwater infrastructure, on the other hand, does a bunch of other things. Besides just manage flooding and slow stormwater. It helps manage pollution. Pollutants such as heavy metals, PCBs, diesel, gas, they can be reduced up to 95% depending on the design and the location, because the stormwater flows through a garden natural system into the soil, into the plants, and those pollutants are maintained in the garden, and they don't flow into the system and then into the bay. It's also a form of greening, and all greening is helpful for reducing the heat island effect. Trees, of course, are particularly good at this, and trees are also particularly good at slowing stormwater. They actually catch the stormwater in their leaves, which is part of slowing it. It's not all about retaining it. Sometimes it's just slowing it so that the system we have doesn't get overwhelmed. We also know that tree canopy is strongly correlated to neighborhood income level in a lot of cities. So aligning greening efforts with low-income neighborhoods is particularly important for an equitable climate resilient approach. We also know that greening neighborhoods have all sorts of psychosocial benefits for residents. Everybody has experienced how much more they enjoy being in a neighborhood that is green, and how much calmer they feel being in a neighborhood that has greening than that is all asphalt. Green schoolyards also, for example, actually improves student attendance and because it makes the school a more desirable place to be. Again, multiple benefits. It's also reducing flooding, making sure kids can actually go to school. It's also cleaning, reducing pollution. It's also creating more biodiversity and habitat. And when it's integrated, when greening is integrated with bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure or traffic calming infrastructure, a bulb out or road diet, making roads more narrow to make cars go slower, it actually is increasing mode shift, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So many things, because it makes biking and walking more desirable and more comfortable. If you can think about this heat wave right now and who's biking on a completely asphalt street that has no greening versus someone who might be biking where there's greenery and trees. And then finally, when we're incorporating GSI into parks, it can actually lower maintenance costs, improve biodiversity, and improve the park experience. So lots of reasons why green stormwater infrastructure is punching above its weight in terms of managing stormwater. So if it's so great, why don't we have more of it? Some of the barriers to more green stormwater infrastructure is funding. There are few dedicated funding streams, and road funding would be such an awesome way to fund green stormwater infrastructure, so we can have not just complete streets, but green streets. However, the way that these funding mechanisms are constructed, GSI is more expensive than just a regular old bike lane, but then scoring criteria doesn't give any extra points for including resilience into a bike and ped project, and so those projects are not competitive. This is changing, however, which is great to see. The infrastructure bill, the federal infrastructure bill, has money for resilient transportation, and Caltrans has programs that will fund resilient transportation, including managing flooding in our streets. The money that was just awarded or allocated to the EPA for the San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund, $52 million a year for bay restoration and pollution prevention, which Save the Bay has been working with many partners to see happen for over a decade. That money can be used for green stormwater infrastructure, reducing pollution and managing stormwater. And then we see municipalities pursuing their own funding in order to meet Clean Water Act regulations. New taxes are quite challenging for many reasons. Also, they require a 2/3 majority, which is hard on a good day, and stormwater is not usually people's favorite thing to spend money on. But municipalities are seeing the need and starting to prioritize this in their efforts. A second barrier is maintenance. With all infrastructure in cities, building capital money is easier to come by than operations and maintenance money, and GSI is no different. But we also need to make sure we're treating GSI like any infrastructure project. Infrastructure requires maintenance. It needs to be built into the planning. Just because it's plants doesn't mean it's not important to maintain. And one really cool solution to this, is that some regions have workforce development programs. San Jose is a great example, the San Jose Conservation Corps, which is a youth workforce development program that actually is doing the work and teaching young people about green stormwater infrastructure and about riparian zones and other natural areas that they're maintaining. And they're doing the work of the maintenance. And so it's green job training, youth workforce development, and GSI maintenance all at once. So we do see cities addressing it in different ways, and that's a really awesome one that has all these multiple benefits. A third challenge or barrier to seeing GSI happen is a lack of integrated planning. If anybody works in urban planning, you know that cities have so many plans. They have Vision Zero plans. They actually have green stormwater infrastructure plans. It's a requirement because of the regional water boards and the Clean Water Act's requirements. They have to have GSI plans. There's transportation plans. There's greening plans. But no city that I have found has someone in charge of making sure that GSI happens. They're often the responsibility is spread throughout different departments, the Parks Department, Department of Transportation, the Public Works, and then the Environmental Services, and everybody has a piece of the pie. When everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. So we get these new bike lanes are being built on corridors that have been identified as priorities for GSI, but the coordination isn't happening to make sure that the GSI is built at the same time. If you're going to tear up the street, that's the time to put it back together right, which includes green stormwater infrastructure, climate resilience, and mode shift. All that needs to happen at the same time. What I've found is really this takes the initiative of motivated city staffers. And there are some very motivated city staffers, and I love them for that. We can't really just depend on city staffers who think it's a good idea to be ensuring that our cities are ready for climate resilience and climate change. So what we're doing is we're working to push policies that require this kind of integrated planning, where we would appoint a GSI director or leader whose job it is to move GSI forward in the city and make sure those GSI plans are being implemented. And that's the fourth barrier, I think, is just, cities are stuck in what doesn't work, and they often focus on what can't work and what doesn't work. So many times I talk to folks, I'm like, can we put GSI there? They say, well, the roads are too narrow and we don't have any money. Not every road is too narrow, and there isn't no money, there is some money. So the question is, are we being innovative? Are we treating this with the urgency that it deserves to take advantage of opportunities, try new things, realize that the status quo isn't working? Don't look where it doesn't work, look where it does work, and just some kind of more innovative approaches to thinking. I think that's another barrier, or another space that we could be making progress. So there is an opportunity for you to help. In terms of supporting nature-based climate resilience, there's actually currently a bill, SB 272, which is sponsored by Senator Laird, that will require cities to submit shoreline resilience plans that align with regional guidelines that BCDC is creating, the Bay Conservation and Development Commission. And that's actually aligned with the Bay Adaptation Atlas that Ellen was talking about, that SFBI helped with. This kind of regional planning and regional approach to climate resilience is really necessary if we're going to protect all residents, and not just residents in high-income cities that have the staff and the prioritization to be planning for climate change. So this is an exciting opportunity. This same bill actually passed through the legislature last year, basically unanimous support, but was vetoed by Governor Newsom. So Laird is trying again this year, and we are asking our city council members across the Bay and residents across the Bay to show Governor Newsom how important climate resilience is to the Bay Area. And if you'd like to help support and make sure that this bill passes, you can sign our petition at savesfbay.org/take-action, and I can put that in the chat as well. And with that, thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversation. Oh, that's it.
Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, please do drop that in the chat, and everyone should do that if you can. And I saw one question in the chat. Let me see if I can get to it now. But thank you so much, Haley. That was amazing. The question was, Rochelle posed the question about the Oakland Airport expansion, and how that's going to impact, if anybody wants to, because she said something about 16 new terminals or something. So that sounds like a lot, but anyone want to take that?
Can I just clarify that it is because the land can't be expanded there, the plan is to remove the existing terminal and add 16 new terminals to the amount that already is there. In terms of so many things that this impacts, it certainly makes me wonder about what it means to do that in a place that is going to have even more water.
I can
Thank
speak
you,
to that
Rochelle.
briefly. If you're asking about sea level rise adaptation for the Port of Oakland and the airport specifically.
Yes.
Yeah, so those folks have been engaged in the San Leandro Bay, Oakland, Alameda shoreline working group. They're actively studying sea level rise vulnerability at the Oakland airport, and they've been engaged in efforts to raise their levees, improve their seismic soundness, and certainly is high on their list of priorities at the airport, from what I understand. And airports, you know, are very valuable, very highly developed areas that are likely to continue to pursue those hard gray infrastructure solutions for sea level rise adaptation in the near future, from what we can see and what we've observed. And I don't know much about the expansion plans, so I can't really speak to that.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any more questions? You can raise your hand. I'm sorry, I was muted. I was just wondering if anybody else has any more questions. If you want to raise your hand, please do. I don't see any more hands raised. But we got a lot of information here, and it was amazing. All the presentations were incredible. I learned so much today. We have a lot of work to do. I see Kelly Hammergran has her hand, and Aurora, and there were some questions in the chat about the recording. Yes, the recording will be available when it's available. It takes a couple days to get it, so we'll send it out. Look for it in your email. If I have your email, which I should, because if you registered, but if you didn't, please do. So Aurora and I just lost the other name, but anyway, go first. Whoever wants to go first, go first.
Okay, I'll go first. This is Aurora. Thank you everyone for your work. I wanted to kind of wrap it back around to how we began with Corinna Gould and the conversation around salmon restoration. I guess I'm dreaming here of a plan, maybe that your organizations could collaborate. Is there a plan to what would the bay look like if we, when we restore the salmon? Like, what is the plan needed that would actually get us back to having our salmon, coming home and running again and bringing that, like the Stockton River was the most fertile salmon run in the North Bay, in this area. And right now we have a polluted river with a lot of impacts, but so is there a transition plan? And is that, that's what I'm wondering. Is there a collaborative vision that could come together around that?
Thank you, Aurora. Who wants to take that question? I don't know if Karina's still here too.
I can talk briefly on Baykeeper's work because we do work throughout the entire San Francisco Bay watershed up into the Delta. And we actually recently were part of a day of action in Sacramento for water justice and salmon. So that is definitely part of our work as well. I think, and I want to shout out, I see someone from Restore the Delta here. So they were also integral in that day. So there's definitely like many organizations working on this issue and the connection to the San Francisco Bay. And one thing that we're really prioritizing and that we think is critical for salmon, of course, is freshwater flows, increasing our freshwater flows into the bay. So that's something that I think that's a really good point, Aurora, and that we should all be working together and realize that the health of the bay is really connected to the health of the Delta. And in order to restore all of that, we need increased freshwater flows and less water diversions. Yeah.
Thank you for taking that, Julia. Another question was in the chat. Whoops, thank you, Julia. So another question in the chat is, how can I get shallow well water testing in my backyard in San Leandro? I don't know if anybody can answer that. Oh, did you guys hear me? My computer keeps
Yes,
tripping. And I don't know if anybody else can answer that. But maybe we can figure that out. Somebody can, I don't know. I have no idea for myself. So
Kelly's
I have no
also got her
idea. And,
hand up.
pardon?
Kelly has her hand up too.
Okay, go ahead, Kelly. Sorry. I lost track of that one.
Okay, I had a question. I think this goes to Haley Courier on nature-based solutions. So here in Berkeley, they're going to be doing dredging soon, and they have this big grant or loan to do dredging. And how do we make connections between nature-based solutions where you need soil to fill in to do restoration and cities that are planning on doing dredging and trying to figure out where they're going to send the soil they dredge?
If I understand your question, is it how do we get the city to do something that we want them to do?
Right, yes.
Well, with all advocacy, we identify who has the power to make the change that we want to see. We organize ourselves and show that there's more than just one random Berkeley resident. Of course, there are many people, especially in Berkeley, who care about this issue, and make sure that they understand the science and best practices, and that there are a lot of people interested in this issue. And so I actually believe that Berkeley is embarking on a planning process around around flood resilience and green stormwater infrastructure soon. And so, you know, when processes like that are always a good entry point, but certainly never a sufficient way to make sure that cities are looking at things comprehensively. But that is, and also, you know, I think maybe Cheryl would have more to say about this, but I believe there's some council members on Berkeley City Council who would be champions for particular issues. So if you want to engage your city council to see what the opportunities are and encourage them to be thinking comprehensively about flooding and make sure that these different pieces are being addressed together, that could also be a good approach.
I think you missed the point, and that is like Scott Ferris in Parks is in charge of the dredging, and I just don't see much of a focus here on the environment. I mean, they say the words, but the actions don't follow. So how is it possible to make that connection between where soil is needed for restoration and dredging that is planned? And if that has to go through city council, that's probably going to be a year after the dredging is done.
Yeah, you want to speak to that, Ellen? Actually,
Yeah, I can weigh in on this. So this is an issue that SFEI has looked into. How do we better connect folks who are doing dredging, who have sentiment available, with the restoration projects that need it? We have a tool called Set and Match that you might look into. I'll drop the link to that tool into the chat here. And I think, yeah, the key thing is identifying a nearby project that might benefit And if you want to follow up with me, perhaps I can make some connections and point you in the right direction.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your presentations. They were amazing. We're going to take a 5-minute break. And next up, I hope you all are back. We're going to have drinking water and climate change. Oh, why is this not? With Kia Rivers. She's a policy advocate for community at the Community Water Center. Kia, take it away.
Thank you, Cheryl.
Thank you.
Everyone, thank you for having me. Go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kaya. I'm a policy advocate at Community Water Center. Most of my work at Community Water Center focuses on drought, climate, and nitrate contamination as it pertains to drinking water. And Community Water Center has been building the movement for water justice for over 16 years now, under the leadership of co-founder and executive director Susana Deanda. And our mission at Community Water Center is to act as a catalyst for community water solutions through organizing, education, advocacy, and advocacy in California. We work to ensure that all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water, and we work alongside directly impacted residents to advocate for more just water policies. Most of our work centers on the Central Coast and in the Central Valley. So climate change and drinking water availability are intrinsically connected, as the climate crisis will only continue to make droughts more frequent, longer, severe, and farm worker and under-resourced communities will be on the front lines of this climate and drinking water crisis. Groundwater is their backup plan. So when California is in a drought, farms who rely at least partially on surface water deliveries from the state must turn to groundwater to irrigate their crops. And new deep wells are drilled, causing groundwater levels to drop. Also, concentration of contaminants can also increase, causing further stress on drinking water supplies and communities. So how can climate change impact drinking water availability specifically? Like I said before, climate change causes more frequent and longer droughts, meaning the number of dry wells across the Central Valley will increase. Right now, there are 2,415 dry wells that we know of right now across the state, and over half of those wells are located in the Central Valley. Additionally, drought also means that also impacts groundwater quality, and as groundwater levels drop, the concentration of the contaminants found in groundwater increases. And as we heard earlier today, severe flooding events are more common now due to intensified wet seasons. With the extra water that we received earlier this year, wells are still going dry. Even as drought impacted residents, communities were being flooded. Specifically, there have been 53 dry wells within the last 30 days, even with all of the water that we got this year. And flooding can also cause these wells to be contaminated with bacteria. The events can also cause road blockages, which may disrupt hauled water and bottled water deliveries, which thousands of residents depend on even during emergencies. And also, as we know, temperatures will continue to climb as climate change accelerates. Many families rely on swamp coolers to stay cool as temperatures rise, which also require water for operation. And many families with dry wells rely on a limited supply of replacement water. And the water needed to operate swamp coolers to stay cool and drinking water to stay hydrated can be put at odds. We also heard a lot about sea level rise today. Climate change will further provoke seawater intrusion on the Central Coast because of sea level rise. And sea level rise coupled with groundwater over extraction, over pumping, further strains drinking water availability. as groundwater basins, freshwater availability is replaced with that seawater. The seawater also affects crops, which means that farm workers' jobs are more at risk. And all of these events right now are already impacting under-resourced communities. As we know, global average temperatures are increasing, and we are projected to first hit 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2027, which is just within the next 4 years. And because climate change is a threat multiplier, frontline communities endure many of the extremes that develop as the climate crisis accelerates, such as whiplash from extreme hot and dry conditions to quick and intense wet seasons. And these extreme conditions of events create resilience challenges for under-resourced communities, especially on the Central Coast and the Central Valley. So just to put that last graph into perspective, we're on the path of leaving the range of temperatures that all of human civilization has experienced for about 10,000 years. The whole time we've had modern civilization, we've experienced fairly stable temperatures, but now we're experiencing temperatures comparable to times when there weren't any humans. So basically temperatures are getting closer to what they looked like in the dinosaur age millions of years ago. And frontline communities will be the first to experience the impacts of this change. So using a tool created by the Union of Concerned Scientists, we learned that on average, Visalia, a city where some of our community partners that we closely work with live, experienced 13 days where temperatures exceeded 100 degrees between 1971 and 2000. And then using that same tool from 2036 to 2055 is projected that number of days will increase, that will exceed 100 degrees will increase from 13 days to about 55 days per year in the future. And that's almost 2 months. So year after year is likely we'll experience more and more hot days in California, putting vulnerable communities at risk at home and at work, especially those who work outside. And then we turn to groundwater during drought, with many communities relying on it for their everyday drinking water needs. We cannot continue to rely on wishful thinking to allow impacts to fall disproportionately on vulnerable communities, especially when it comes to a necessary resource and right such as drinking water. And under the proposed minimum groundwater levels within groundwater sustainability plans established through the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, up to 12,000 or 126,000 people would lose access to this resource by 2040. Then this is a map showing how seawater intrusion has progressed within the last 50 years in the Salinas Valley Basin. Drinking water supply is already put at risk by other groundwater contaminants, and seawater intrusion only further reduces drinking water supply. And even though seawater intrusion makes groundwater undrinkable, fluoride isn't classified as a primary contaminant right now, which makes it difficult for residents to receive replacement water when it's needed. And then one impact of the flooding that happened this year was the flooding of the community of Pajaro. Storms caused the levee in Pajaro Valley to break, leading to the flooding of the nearby community where 2,000 people were impacted. With this incident putting residents out of work and vulnerable with flooded homes and possible contamination with bacteria and also possibly groundwater quality contaminants. The recent disaster that occurred here due to the collapse of the levee also shows how our current infrastructure can't keep up with our changing climate that arise because of it, which threatens whole communities, as we can see here. And as climate change continues to impact groundwater availability, agricultural fields will have to retire. Here it says PPIC states how it's estimated that 500,000 between 1 million acres could come out of regular irrigated agricultural production by 2040. This is just one estimate, and this impacts farm worker jobs. Yeah, less agricultural land means less residents available to work those lands and provide services. And there isn't enough water available to sustain the levels of large scale industrial agriculture. And as this happens, what happens to farm workers and farm worker communities? Additionally, working in extreme heat conditions are dangerous for farm workers. Many residents share with us strategies that they use to keep cool, but from the previous slides, extreme heat can be long lasting. And then also there's crop failure with climate change as well, with flooding and extreme heat. A community partner shared with us how in extreme heat conditions, grapes can lose their sweetness and it impacts profits as well. So over 1 million people are impacted by unsafe drinking water each year. And this graphic shows all of the out of compliance systems there are in the state. People relying on private wells are also significantly impacted by contamination due to not knowing if their water is safe to drink, since they're in charge of getting their well tested for water quality. And even if contamination is found, the options for treatment may be limited and costs for treatment can be prohibitive. Many small rural communities rely solely on groundwater for their drinking water, which when contaminated can pose major health concerns, especially if they were unknowing of their well's water quality. And unsafe tap water can be found in every county of the state, but like areas like San Joaquin Valley and the Salinas Valley, they are proportionally impacted, specifically low income and Latino communities. Contaminated groundwater is primarily the result of intensive agricultural and industrial activities, such as the application of fertilizer and pesticides, large-scale animal feed operations, and mining. Some contaminants are also the result of naturally occurring processes in the groundwater as well. But some contaminants found in water supply are nitrates, arsenic, coliform bacteria, uranium 123 TCP, chromium 6, and PFAS. However, that being said, climate change further puts groundwater quality at risk. Outside of the concentration of contaminants that occurs as groundwater levels drop, climate change charged flooding events also put groundwater quality at risk. Though flooding presents a great opportunity to recharge groundwater basins, it can also decrease water quality when done without drinking water in vulnerable communities in mind. The placement of water onto fields that have high levels of contamination can further seep down into groundwater, increasing concentration, or cause contamination in areas that originally had safe drinking water. So that's always something to keep in mind with all of the water that we're receiving, especially as climate change progresses.
Complicate things.
And then some solutions that can lead to both drinking water resilience and climate resilience for communities include repurposing agricultural land. Specifically, land repurposing can both conserve drinking water for communities while also reducing the impacts of climate change. So some examples of land repurposing include creating recreation areas and communities like what's pictured on the bottom left of the slide. It can provide a place for, create a place where families can enjoy nature while also restoring groundwater quantity by using a lake or a pond for recharge. We can also retire nearby agricultural land, transform that land into a habitat restoration project, which can act as a carbon sink. And farmers can also transition to using sustainable agricultural practices instead of relying on conventional agricultural practices, which use heavy fertilizer and pesticides. And this transition can promote healthy soils, leading to greater groundwater recharge as the soil absorbs more water, the reduction of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and also produce healthier food. Also, solar and wind farms can be constructed to reduce communities' use of fossil fuels. All of the community partners that we work with, consult with, they are really interested in the possibility of affordable, clean energy in their communities. And also because droughts can be exacerbated by climate change, drought resiliency projects like drilling a backup well for communities' water systems can also help secure access to sustainable drinking water while experiencing climate change extremes. And then touching on the point that I just ended with, old infrastructure is another challenge for small rural communities for their water systems. And this weakness is only exacerbated by climate change. And there's a need for climate change resilient infrastructure to ensure that drinking water infrastructure can withstand these extremes, especially for vulnerable communities. So it's important that communities have the resources and funding they need to make these necessary upgrades. So Community Water Center works towards community climate resilience by increasing drinking water resilience, both on the Central Coast and in the Central Valley. We engage in SB 552, a comprehensive state, county, and water supplier drought planning law. And under SB 552, small water suppliers must create plans to identify future water shortages and actively prepare for them. Additionally, small water suppliers are directed to meet requirements to build drought resilience, such as having sufficient well monitoring, having a backup well, and a backup generator so that the well is functioning even in power outages, which are more likely in heat situations. Counties are also directed to make drought resilience plans to support domestic wells and very small water systems that have less than 50 household connections. We also work closely on the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act as well, in order to ensure that drinking water needs are protected as we endure climate changes, and we're prepared and have the resources we need to make sure everyone has drinking water through the crisis. Between 80% and 90% of the populations in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast rely on groundwater for drinking water, and we need to preserve what we have left. And then lastly, Community Water Center engages with different land repurposing programs. One is the multi-benefit land repurposing program created by the Department of Conservation in order to promote the retirement of agricultural land to sustain our groundwater resources. And we really try to engage in the program to make sure that these projects can provide climate and community benefits, ensuring that communities are engaged in the process and projects are really developed with their needs in mind. So our work focuses on implementing and working alongside community partners to implement the human right to water law in California, which states every human has the right to safe, clean, affordable, and accessible water adequate for human consumption, cooking, and sanitary purposes. However, achieving the human right to water for all communities across California, regardless of race and income, will become increasingly more difficult as the climate crisis persists. So that is all that I had for everyone today. Thank you for having me, and I'm welcome to take any questions. I also really enjoyed listening to all the other presentations, hearing about what's going on in other regions of the state. So thank you.
Thank you, Kia. That was amazing. A lot more information that I did not realize and did not know. And what I really appreciate is the California human rights to water. Like, we all need to be getting our council to pass that legislation. That's amazing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Does anybody have any questions for Kaya, I mean?
Yeah,
I
was just gonna say,
apologize.
just
I'm so bad with names.
No worries.
I had a quick question about the bill that she mentioned, not the one that passed, 552. Could you just say what that is, please?
Yeah.
SB 552.
Yes. Yeah, it's a bill or a law now that was passed a couple years ago. It started going into implementation last year, but it's just a bill that promotes comprehensive drought planning on the state, local, and very local side, including small water suppliers. So small water suppliers are tasked to make sure that their systems are drought resilient, and there's funding for them to do that. Also, counties are required to make a drought task force that meets regularly to prepare for drought, as well as make a plan that would support small water supply, really, I guess, community water systems with 15 connections or less and domestic wells, trying to analyze the county to see where areas are most vulnerable to drought, and then actively proactively prepare for drought and its impacts.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't see any more hands raised, so, and we're 2 minutes early, so we can just get started with our next presentation with Cheryl Sudeth. It was funny because when Cheryl called me, because she called me and I answered the phone and I like, hello. And she's like, hey, Cheryl, this is Cheryl. And, you know, that doesn't happen to me like ever. So I didn't take it seriously. So I just thought that was really funny. But I've known Cheryl for quite some time now. Well, being an elected official, we met back in the day. And I appreciate her for being here. It's environmental justice in a time of unjust decisions. Cheryl Sudeth, she's an elected president, board of directors of West County Wastewater District. And she's been traveling. So I don't know where you're at now, but we were just on a Zoom the other day and or on her call, she was in New York, then she went to Chicago. So I don't know where she's at, but she's here today. So thank you, Cheryl, for being here.
Oh, goodness. I'm actually on 2 computers, so. Yeah, good morning, everyone. Yeah, this is a day. And so we're going to spend, I'm gonna do something different than.
We don't see you like you're, yeah, there you go.
I know. I told you I'm on 2 computers. I'm going to do something a little different than most of your presenters. So I'm going to talk to you, but I'm going to talk to you in a conversational way. And I'm doing that because, you know, what I want to talk to you about is something that has been happening in our midst right now. Cheryl told you a little bit about me. And so I'm going to tell you that, and then I'm going to start the presentation. I think that's some of what's been going on in our in our society has really captured everyone's attention, but I want to put it into perspective. So yes, I'm an elected official. I'm the president of the board of directors of West County Wastewater. I'm also represent Northern California as the vice chair of the Democratic of CADM Environmental Caucus. I also sit as the chair, the acting chair of the California African American Water Education Fund. I'm a fellow with the Water Education for Latino Leaders, and I also am a fellow with the Latinos in Transit. I do a lot of work in the environmental space. I am a cell molecular biologist and biochemist by training. And so I'm not going to get as academic in this, but I do want to make sure that we can capture hearts, minds, bodies, spirit, and soul in what we're going to talk about today. So let's share the screen and let's get rolling. Here we go. So when I talk about I might not be able to see you as I'm talking about this. So Cheryl, tell me if anything goes awry. The environmental justice in unjust times is what I wanted to talk about today. And I said that because we've got some unjust justices making decisions for us. And I want to clear up a little bit of language. A lot of times we hear the term disadvantaged communities. I don't believe they're disadvantaged. I believe that we are under-resourced. So I'm not going to use that term today. So let's start here. One of the things that we want to clear up is make sure we all have a really good definition of what it means for environmental justice. Fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. That comes directly from the EPA. Not Cheryl's definition, the EPA. So what does that mean in people language? It means that people from these so-called disadvantaged populations, again, this is not my definition, are more likely to be employed in occupations with higher levels of exposure and to live in more highly contaminated communities. And environmental justice is supposed to correct whatever this inequity is. And that came from the President's Cancer Panel annual report of 2009, which is why we see it all across the country. You have these so-called cancer alleys or communities where we have more incidences of cancer and different diseases, because that's where it's based on where they live. What's our goal? Well, our goal is to grow a culture where environmental justice is empowering the most marginalized communities to act, speak, and stand up for themselves. So what's an environmental justice community? It's a community that has a combination of high risk of exposure to pollution in the air, water, and soil, where residents are burdened by extreme amounts of socioeconomic and health issues, usually located near freeways and major roads and or industrial use facilities. Those residents usually face a lot of the greatest combination of pollution, health, and socioeconomic issues, generally receive less investment in the people, in the businesses, in agencies, and it leaves those residents with fewer resources and inequitable opportunities for health and prosperous life. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because, wait, did I get muted? No.
We hear you.
Okay. I just got a message on my computer to unmute myself. I'm telling you this because a lot of times when we talk, we're talking as if people understand what that means. Now, that's different from a marginalized community. A marginalized community, a lot of times when we're talking about an EJ community as if it's just a community of so-called community of color. But a marginalized community can be any community where there's a group of people who have been excluded, neglected, or discriminated against for social, economic, political, or any other reason as a result of unequal access to services and representation. And I want to make sure that that's really, really important. It can be an elderly community, a community of people with disabilities, an immigrant community. It could be any community for any one of those reasons. In California, 61.1% of the people are people of color. In the Bay Area, that percentage is 64.5%. In California, 28.7% are low income. In the Bay Area, That's almost half. Many people here in California speak a language other than English. 1 in 10 speak English less than very well. That means, look how many people we have in marginalized communities. So let's talk about environmental justice. A lot of times we're talking about environmental justice as if we're talking about equity, equality, and things of that nature. I'm framing this for you, so when we get to talking about the SCOTUS decision, you'll have a better frame of mind rather than emotional. So environmental justice. The US EPA says fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. What does that mean? Environmental justice embodies the principles that communities and populations should not be disproportionately exposed to adverse environmental impacts. And when you look at the first People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, they said embrace the 17 principles of environmental justice. That also means that that justice is across 5 real principles: distributive justice, procedural justice, corrective justice, social justice, and structural justice. So what does it look like? I know a lot of you have seen these first 2 pictures, but have you seen the third one? So the environmental justice movement historically has addressed the distinctions between just equality and equity, but justice itself has to be addressed. And these concepts has to say, okay, fine. You see these little boxes and it says everybody gets the same benefits from the same supports. That's equal treatment. Okay, great. But then you say, all right, if I make everyone on this equitable playing field, it says that everybody gets the supports that they need. And that's this affirmative action approach. That's producing equity, right? But justice says, get rid of the barrier in the first place. If I get rid of all of the barriers that cause the equity in the first place, which is why you see the removal of the fence, if you get rid of those systemic barriers in the first place, then everyone has the ability to not only see the game, but also enjoy the life, fresh air, fresh water, or clean air, clean water, fresh food, and enjoy the life without supports or accommodations. That is justice. And that is the difference between equality, equity, and justice. Now, let's talk about it this way. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, and income. That's the goal. So let's talk about this on, I want to come back. So let's talk about this on, when we talk about unjust. So we talk about what justice looks like. So what does it look like when it's applied to different laws, or what's happening in our judicial system? So I'm going to give you one that came across when we fought for it in our state level. So SB 1000 was one that we fought for a few years ago, and it mandated that cities and counties have to update their public policies for under-resourced. It actually said disadvantaged. I changed the word. Under-resourced communities, to make sure they reduce any unique or compounded health risks, that they promote civil engagement in the public decision-making process, and they prioritize improvements in programs. So what went wrong with the recent SCOTUS waters decision? That's the decision that was made on the waters of the US. That say that where the US Supreme Court narrowed what the Clean Water Act jurisdiction over the wetlands in the Sackett versus the EPA case. And that case is basically under the Clean Water Act. What went wrong there? And I'm going to go back to the previous mention where I told you about equity versus justice. And if any of you are paying any attention to anything that the Supreme Court has been saying and any of its latest decisions about justice decisions, they have been talking particularly about due process, equity, and they've been referring back to that on a constant basis. And what they ruled was that the Biden administration had overstepped its jurisdictional boundaries. How does CEQA impact in environmental justice. It's going to be the same thing. It's a justice. It has to do with justice. We're going to come back to same thing. How does local and state decision making aid and or harm environmental justice efforts? This one's going to hit more home to most people here, because most of our local and state decision making decisions on city councils, on water boards, any special districts, any county boards. The decisions that we make on a local level, on a state level, on whether it's housing, whether it's rulemaking and permitting, whether it's developing a climate action plan, a sustainability committee plan, a materials management plan, a solid waste master plan, compliance and enforcement, any of those decisions, if they are not made with a justice lens, and notice I say justice and not equity lens, is going to affect whether or not you have so-called environmental justice. Are they responsibly made based on what is happening in the community that is being impacted? In order to do that, you have to take into effect what are the impacts of the decision being made. Are the decisions creating systemic barriers or lifting systemic barriers? Are the decisions being made addressing supports or accommodations to further barriers or to take away traditional barriers? When SB 1000 passed the Senate floor for equitable land use policy, part of that was, it was called the Planning for Healthy Communities Act a few years ago. It mandated that environmental justice must be included in every jurisdiction's general plan. It also included this implementation toolkit for every community to use. So, take a step back, looking at, okay, but not every community understands or did understand the impact of some of its actions, going back to how local actions can harm. Red lining, blue lining, and green lining. How many of you even know what blue lining is? Go ahead, throw up your hand. I won't tell anybody, it's just us. You're real quiet. I know a lot of you have heard the word red lining, but this is verbatim from surveyor descriptions of red line areas in the 1930s. Odors and noises from local industries, infiltration of colored and orientals, predominance of older cheap cottages are zoned for industry. Odors from factories, infiltration of orientals and colored. Adjoining industrial area with attendant odor, smoke, etc. Nearest to the industries, thereby being mainly occupied by wage-earning families. That is what they put next to the housing that was allowable for these families. You can tell me who knew what blue lighting was before I tell you what it is. See, Cheryl admits she don't know what it is. Come on, I'll tell you what it is if you don't know. So blue lining is that process of, it's also called like underwater writing, right? It is that process where banks and insurers, they now use, they draw lines around the areas that are risky, have a risk of climate disasters. So buying and insuring real estate in these high-risk areas are really, really complex, if not impossible. So it's the new form of redlining. So if you live in a flood zone, if you live in a so-called a earthquake fault zone, if you live in a family in Puerto Rico, right? If you live in certain areas, they've been hit by tornadoes repeatedly. If you live in like what happened in like Paradise in Northern California, in fire zones, that's the process of blue lining. Most of you probably never heard of it, but it happens If you live in certain areas where theft and now it's not called blue lining in those areas. They don't say it, but there's what happens. If you live in a high risk zone, typically is relegated to so-called climate. But if it's a risky insurance based on your climate, flood, your next to in Richmond area will be like Chevron, or if you live by the Delta, if you live by any one of the refineries, there's like 6 of them acting over here in Contra Costa. Good luck with your insurance. There's blue line. Then you have green line. So rather than just fighting redlining, which we know is an illegal practice, but it still goes on. So don't think just because it's illegal, it doesn't still happen, because it does still happen. Greenlining is the proactive effort to try and bring profitable investments, trying to invest more in these communities that have been left behind. Now, the Greenlining Institute, which is based right in Oakland, has been around since '93, and it's been a force for working in Black and Brown communities to build wealth and teach communities to advocate for themselves on how to build up the communities and live healthy. Defining racial equity, transforming behaviors, building up institutions and systems to counteract the disproportionate harm that has been done to Black and Brown communities, low-income communities that have been harmed by unjust policies and acts of redlining and blue lining has been one of the backboners of EJ. But then there's been another thing that's been happening. How many of you know what greenwashing is? So then we have greenwashing. Of course, you're going to have it because we live in a corporate society. We live in a society that focuses on how can I make money. So greenwashing is that practice where companies or market a product or service that they say is going to have a positive impact on the community. You know, they do these false or misleading type of advertising or marketing. It says that, oh, this has a positive environmental impact, and they even get people to endorse it, when in fact most of the time it is untrue or is only partially true. One of the biggest issues that I have as a person who is working in the water industry and also in transportation is biggest greenwashing fallacy is flushable wipes. Wipes are not flushable, none of them. So I don't even care what they say on there. I'm just going to tell you right now, the biggest thing you can do is tell people, stop putting stuff down the toilet. It ruins our sewage systems. It ruins your pipes, ruins everything. So this one. So then we have the science of disproportionate environmental impacts. It only became a big deal during the pandemic because we saw that injustices have this force multiplier, but it was always an injustice. When you have natural environmental disasters built on top of environmental disasters and communities living in proximity to all of these pollution sources and all of the social environmental issues, that's when you saw the issues come to the front and people actually began to see, wait, these health disparities are so large that many of these communities have the highest rates of asthma and respiratory disease, heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, childhood issues, and natural disasters when we had the orange haze over the Bay Area a couple of years ago, and wildfires, and right now this heat wave we're going through, the pandemic just escalated it, brought it to the front. So how do we consider environmental justice in lieu of Title VI in the Civil Rights Act? The EPA has a screening tool called the Environmental Justice Screening and Mapping Tool, EJ Screen. And I will make sure I get this to Michelle, and she can get this to you guys. You can go on there and you can look up your own communities and see where you fall. And you can also look up other communities and see there's lots of information on this tool. I won't go through it in depth. Some of the things you can look up on there is, what is my ozone level? What is the diesel particulate matter on the freeway that you use? What is the PM 2.5 in my area? And what are the effects of the trucks that travel on the roads that you take? Where are the cleanup sites that I can go to? What are some of the issues that face Bay Area residents right now? A lot of residential neighborhoods are adjacent to Bay Area freeways. As a result, these cars and trucks that pass by every day expose us to a lot of air pollution. Water quality is an issue, groundwater contamination in industrial areas. And so people have to not only pay for things like East Bay mud, they still got to go and buy bottled water, which of course increases the number of plastic that we have. We have lead contamination. We have nitrates. The local soils testing since over the last 7 or 8 years has skyrocketed in the number of ppm that we have. The land use compatibility, and here's that bottled water I spoke about. When you go to buy more bottled water, the plastic has to go somewhere, and we're in the middle of no plastic July. I don't think most people know about that, but this was happening. So the proximity to living next to trash sorting facilities or auto and salvage businesses, metal processing, chemical plants, crematoriums, there's more and more housing being built by crematoriums, and still we still have people living next to refineries, causes health issues. Our local air quality, whether it's CARB or BACMed, we are seeing a lot of air quality concerns, whether that's coming direct or it's at the trail winds. The Bay Area, despite its reputation of progressivism, it still has a historic issue of environmental justice, whether it's going down I-80 and the draining corridors, the landfills, the mining, the green gentrification. I call it that because as buildings get greener, they get more expensive, and it moves the people who were living there out of those neighborhoods. And with floods and extreme weather, the asthma's tied to the refineries and the urban tree covered density. So what's the challenge? The challenge is that marginalized members of our communities have less voice in community development, in part because environmental justice learning is just not a systemic priority. And as a result, many people have been disproportionately exposed to health and environmental hazards. So what we need is a community-driven environmental justice. So rather than create something new, we need to weave environmental justice training into existing trainings. So what's the strategy? Sustainability and EJ. Sustainability and EJ, they all go together, right? Everything goes together. Sustainability has to take people, profit, and the planet into account. We have so many parks and other recreational resources that we need them to be within walking distance of our houses. We need to have parks where it's well thought out, where we have drinking fountains and we have totlets and we have skating there, but it's well thought out and it's accessible to everyone. And who should we be talking to in the community? We should be talking to the neighborhood associations, the impacted community members, the youth-led programs, the community-based organizations. Yes, we can talk to the local businesses. And yes, we can have general plan advisory groups and community linkage forums. But then none of that matters if you're not talking to the people who are most impacted by the injustices. And what changes are needed or should be proposed to the injustices that we are seeing? We should consider changes to the goals, policies, and actions that will improve existing and future conditions for everyone, and with a focus on those in greatest need of help and protection. We can minimize adverse environmental impacts, we can empower communities, and we can foster economic opportunities. What does that mean? Reduce exposure to pollution. So we can develop strategies and support regulations that will help reduce exposure to air pollution and hazardous materials. We can have a potential action that says coordinate with BOCMED and all of our local stakeholders to pursue a priority community designation for those eligible environmental justice areas for the East Bay. We need to improve our public facilities. That means you increase access to community health facilities, the parks, the community centers, and other public services and facilities, particularly in underserved areas. And we see that now, especially with these heat waves going on. Conduct a community survey next year and every 3 years afterwards that's related to community health, air quality concerns, and community service needs that are focused on outreach to EJ areas. And that means you talk to the people who are most impacted. As an elected official, talking to me is great, but I'm not the one most affected. Promote healthy food. Isn't that beautiful? As a vegan, I'm telling you, that's just beautiful. That's just a beautiful picture. We need to improve the health and wellness of all residents through policies, regulations, and programs that foster healthier food options. And then we need to identify those neighborhoods that have limited healthy food sources and prioritize them for development of healthy food options. Real grocery stores. Stop putting little markets in underserved communities. And then we put Trader Joe's and we put Whole Foods in the other communities. Everybody deserves a farmer's market and community gardens. Every single community, especially underserved communities. And then create safe and sanitary housing. Every community deserves it. So we need to add to the existing efforts so we can reduce health hazards that are associated with construction materials, building standards, and deferred maintenance. That means that the workers who are building this housing deserve to be protected as well. Increase physical activity. Encourage people to get outside. Encourage them to get outside. I know it's great to exercise, indoors, but encourage people to get outside and complete a Bay Area-wide Parks and Recreation Master Plan so that everybody has access. And I'm wrapping it up, Cheryl. Enhance civic engagement. I gave a shout out to Cal, all you Cal people. Increase the amount and quality of community engagement and create an environmental quality city interagency team and website so everybody can vet their concerns. Who can be trained? Potential people to be trained is basically everybody. We need some model programming. If somebody has a model program, we need a place where we can go. We need to measure the success and hold people accountable. And then we need to have some national priorities so we can all work together, especially don't forget tribal and indigenous peoples. And then we need to go back to our SDGs on a global scale and include them in what we're doing. Lastly, gracias. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. That was amazing. My computer's like tripping. I'm not sure. Hopefully it doesn't quit on me. But thank you, Cheryl. That was great. Oh, sorry, my computer is acting crazy right now. But thank you, Cheryl. That was amazing. And we're gonna move right along because we want to make sure that we get bodies of water. Actually, that's the title I made up. She might have a title different, but Rahima Nitoto is the Thirsty for Change program coordinator at Healthy Black Families. Thank you, Rahima, for being here. And you're up next.
Oh, thank you so much, Cheryl. Yeah, and thank you, everybody. It's like there's so much amazing information, and it's I love the way everything is just flowed into each other and built upon each other. And we're coming toward the end of the program, and what I want to talk about is us as humans, us as human beings, on the fringes, under-resourced, absolutely. And one of those resources that we are have a limited supply of is water. safe drinking waters, safe water to bathe in. And not only when it comes to access, but also like just kind of the mental, emotional understanding of how important water is because of the propaganda that's put and advertisement that's been put into their communities. Let's see here. Go. All right, of course, we talked in a lot of different ways about how there is no life without water. And no matter what stage we are in our development as humans, water is absolutely important to every stage of our lives. There isn't, I studied biochemistry and the biochemistry of the human body, and all of the chemical reactions that happen in our body happen in water. Without water, they would not happen, or they would not happen correctly. So that basically tells you, you can see, oh, there's this much water in our system, but that tells you something. It tells you that having water available is really important. We've talked a lot about how climate change is affecting environmentally by flooding and drought, and how those disasters affect people. And we've also talked about how those disasters can actually do things like limit the amount of supply we have to water, and also contaminate our supply of water, as in if we have severe flooding, contaminants in the soil could actually be pushed into drinking water, especially if people are using groundwater as their drinking water. And so access to water is really important. And of course, because of that, we can't live without water. And it's like, what's really interesting to me is how as we are moving more and more into situation where water becomes more and more needed, and more like, what's always been needed, but what I want to say is more and more dire as far as our need, because our ability to protect our clean water supply becomes harder. What's happening is, instead of finding, leaning into all of these really awesome techniques for securing it and increasing the amount of water we have, what we actually have is ways of cordoning off and monetizing the water that we do have available. So we end up having bottled water, or people who you have to buy really high-end reverse osmosis or other systems in order to actually get the water that you need in order to survive. I mean, this water is something that people, a lot of us end up having to purchase. And Latino and African American households are twice as likely as white households not to have access to clean drinking water, while Native people are 19 times more likely not to have clean drinking water and have limited access to drinking water. And I think about that when they say twice as or 19 times, it's like, it's like 100%. So it's like twice as likely. If it was 100%, that's 200%. And for Native people, it goes from 100% to 1900%. It's ridiculous. So it's like what we end up being is the people who water is monetized for at the highest, and will have limited access to. One of the things I wanted to talk about is like my background is not only water and talking about the sugar sweetened beverages. Sugar sweetened beverages is a lot of times is what has been substituted for when it comes to water in our community. And because of that, it's like not only are we not getting hydrated the way we need to, we're actually being poisoned at the same time with sugar, which is highly toxic, highly addictive, as we all know, and end up creating a lot more health problems. But as since we've gone through a lot and talked about a lot of the connection of water to climate, I will also just want to talk about the connection of water to our bodies specifically and talk about dehydration. One of the things that I think is really interesting right now is, Black and brown people, we are the canary in the coal mine, but dehydration, the fact that we're not drinking enough water is something that is a national epidemic. Most people don't drink enough water. And because of that, we have issues of acute and chronic dehydration. Acute dehydration, of course, is something that, is so what's the word, like dire, so dangerous in the moment, and it comes on immediately and could be something that could make you so sick that you need to go to the hospital or something like that right away. Whereas something that's chronic is something that something that you may live with every day for years and is affecting you, but you don't know it. And what I'm going to be talking about in a moment are these things that are affecting us. And I'm seeing that my time is winding down really fast because we're coming to the end. So I'll just go through a short amount of what I have since we're running out of time. But I wanted to also mention that Latinos, African Americans, and Native Americans are have a higher chance of lead exposure in the water. And sometimes it's not only just because of the lead pipes and stuff, sometimes it's because of like in Flint, it's like everybody's water was fine until their city council decided to save money and decided to use the water from the river rather than, which wasn't safe, and it ruined the pipes and pushed lead into the water, which I think is one of the things I like to talk about in my with folks that I have discussions with on a regular basis, to know that we have to know what our city council is doing. We have to know what our city, all of our city officials are doing in order to make sure that we're protecting ourselves against their hubris, if nothing else, put it nicely. Okay. So chronic dehydration is excessive tiredness, confusion, disorientation, dizziness. You might feel like you're gonna vomit, and you can go into fits and seizures. These are things that'll happen like in the temperatures that we're having now. Because of climate change, the temperatures are rising. And excuse me, this should be say acute. This is not chronic, but it's acute. And with the temperatures rising, we end up getting a lot of heat and heat stroke and heat exhaustion. And a lot of times that goes hand in hand with with acute dehydration. Okay. And for chronic dehydration, I usually go into this a little bit more, but I'll go into it just briefly. It's noon. If I can just take 2 more minutes, I'll just go through a couple of these. But a lot of times our asthma and allergies are because we're not drinking enough water. Constipation is a very common symptom. digestive problems. Again, it's like all of those processes that our bodies need to do to actually break down food for digestion are disrupted when there isn't enough water actually to have those systems work. Okay, fatigue. A lot of times it's like if you're tired during the day, it's really important to make sure you have enough water in order to not be fatigued. And one of the things I like, so I'll just go over this really, was one other one, and then I'll go over really quickly. High blood pressure. Our blood is 94% water, and then the rest are solids in your blood. If you don't have enough water in your blood, in your the plasma of your blood, in order to move your blood around efficiently, it's harder to circulate. It's like having a smoothie going through a straw, which is harder to pull up when you're sucking on it than having water. You know, it can get into your mouth a lot easier, or like a thick milkshake. The higher the higher the amount of solids in your blood, the harder it is for your heart to push it. And so you end up with high blood pressure and other circulatory problems. Now, I wanted to just briefly talk about how much water are we supposed to have? And that ends up being a lot of times they say 8-ounce glasses of water, which is standard for a regular person. But when we're looking at people on because we're all different sizes and weights, it's usually a good idea to take your weight, divide it by 2. So if you're 120 pounds, that would be 60. And then drink that many ounces of water during the course of the day. And that is the minimum amount of water you need in your body in order to have a healthy working body, which most of us don't do. Yeah, and just one of the other things I wanted to mention is how as a culture we actually push people toward chronic dehydration. Chronic dehydration is something that we teach our children when we're potty training them, when we don't give them water when they are asking for it, when they're small, especially when it's late when it's late and they need to go to bed. And it's more convenient for us to let them go to bed without the water in order so they don't pee the bed. And also when they're in school, when they're going through school. And of course, teachers don't want children getting up and going to the bathroom. And so it's like we limit the amount of water or other liquids that they get in order to get them to sit longer for a lesson. And what we're doing is teaching chronic dehydration, so we become adults that don't actually drink enough water. And all of this kind of dovetails into it. I would actually talk about how this connects to sugary sweetened beverages and then back to the climate, but I don't have the time. So I don't want to keep everybody, want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you for letting me go over. And yes, if anybody has any quick questions, I'd love to answer them. But aside from that, we can get ready to. Oh.
Sorry about that. I had to switch computers, and so I'm having little difficulty. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think Jessica has a question.
Oh, hi. Sorry. No, I was just, that was my little applause emoji.
Oh, okay. Applause emoji. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Rahima. That was amazing. And I'm so sorry that you don't have time, but you know what? I think we should offer you another time at the general meeting, because this information is so beneficial. And actually, I feel the last two, I mean, the whole day has been so informative, and it just went in succinct, like to well-rounded information. And so for you to end it on this is really powerful. So thank you, Rahima. And thank you, the Healthy Black Families, for keeping it, keeping our eye on our health, which is our prize. So thank you. And God, we learned so much today. Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers. I don't have, my computer died. I don't know why, but so I don't have the list of all the names in front of me. But thank you to all the speakers, and thank you to all of you who participated and joined us. I was trying to drop in the chat the next series, but it's Climate and Indigenous Leadership on September 15th. And the general meeting will be the Wednesday of the 17th. And then in November, we'll have climate, ableism, and accessibility. January, we'll have climate and gender. And we'll end our series with climate and the prison industrial complex. So stay tuned, stay present. We have a lot of things that we can do. Get your California councils or mayors to pass human rights for water. And now we realize that, you know, there is blue lining. Make sure that doesn't happen in your community. Thank you for that. And we know that we need to protect open space. So do that. We heard that the Delta is the lungs of our waterway. And salmon goes from fresh, salt, then back to fresh. All this is such an amazing information that I did not know. Maybe y'all did, but. And then there was a public comment that we should all be participating in. So do all of that and stay healthy, be safe. We're still in COVID. Wear your mask if you need to. Stay healthy, drink water, because water is life. Thank you, everyone, and have a blessed day. Have a great weekend and enjoy. And we hope to see you September 15th and the 17th. Have a blessed day. Thank you. Thank you, Jack, and thank you to the steering committee and all that have donated. And there's still time to donate. Every little bit counts. No pun intended. Or pun intended. All right. Thank you so much. Have a blessed day, everyone. Thank you, Sabrina Jacobs, for being here. Thank you, everyone. It's been great, really great. And Cheryl, you really laid it down. Oh my goodness. That was so amazing too. All right. Have a blessed day, everyone. Bye.